Today, we step into one of the strangest and most unforgettable corners of the 20th century, a place where a single night, a single building, and a single silent mistake reshaped the way human beings understand the power they had learned to command. We are going far back to the northern edge of what was then Soviet Ukraine, to a small, quiet, carefully planned city tucked between pine forests and slow, dark rivers. We are going to a reactor hall where the hum of machinery once sounded as steady and eternal as the tides. And we are going to follow, carefully and patiently, the long chain of human choices, political secrets, scientific wonders, and ordinary lives that led to the explosion at Chernobyl, the long shadow that followed it, and the quiet, continuing lessons it still whispers to us, almost 4 decades later. If you have ever wondered how a single spring night could change the course of an empire, how a machine built of steel and graphite and water could teach humanity humility, how an ordinary town could vanish into legend in under 48 hours, then stay with me. I will be your companion through the whole long story, and I will take my time so that every detail can settle gently into place. Picture. First, the land itself. It is late April, and the long Ukrainian winter has only recently loosened its grip on the countryside. The rivers have been free of ice for weeks, and the Pripyat, that slow, winding river that lends its name to so many things in this story, runs full and cold through reed beds and willow groves, reflecting a sky that is still pale and pearl-colored at the horizon. Farther north, the Pripyat meets the Dnieper, and beyond that, the great flat plains of Belarus roll away, stitched together with peat bogs and birchwoods, and tiny, weathered villages where storks are just beginning to return to their chimney nests. This is an ancient landscape. People have lived here for thousands of years, cutting hay and raising pigs and keeping bees and watching the seasons turn. And the pattern of their lives has changed more slowly than in almost any other part of Europe. Even in the middle of the 1980s, you could still walk into a village outside the town of Chernobyl and find an old woman in a patterned headscarf pulling water from a wooden well, or a farmer driving a wagon pulled by a patient, shaggy horse down a road that had been a track for longer than anyone could remember. Yet woven gently into this old landscape was something new, something so new that it still seemed a little miraculous. 10 kilometers north of the town of Chernobyl, on the banks of a specially built cooling pond fed by the Pripyat River, stood the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. It was one of the proudest technological achievements of the entire Soviet Union, a complex of enormous reinforced concrete buildings housing 4 working reactors of a uniquely Soviet design, with 2 more under construction nearby. Its 4 tall ventilation stacks, striped in red and white, were visible for miles across the flat fields. And at night, when the lights of the turbine halls glowed against the black sky, the plant looked almost like a great ocean liner that had somehow come to rest far inland, humming and purring through the dark. It produced roughly 1/10 of all the electricity used in Ukraine, feeding the hungry grids of Kiev and beyond. And in a country where electricity meant warmth and bread and industrial strength, that was no small thing. 3 kilometers from the plant stood the town of Pripyat. If the reactor complex was the ship, then Pripyat was the harbor built to serve it. And like every harbor, it had its own character, its own voices, its own smells of cooking, and its own rhythm of footsteps. Pripyat was an atom grad, an atomic city, one of 9 such settlements built across the Soviet Union to house the workers of major nuclear installations. And it was young, only 16 years old, in April of 1986. Younger than many of the children who lived in it. It had been designed from scratch on the principles of late Soviet urban planning, which meant wide, tree-lined avenues, generous public squares, tall apartment blocks with sunny balconies, and careful provision for parks, cultural centers, and sports facilities. The population had grown quickly, from a few hundred pioneers living in prefabricated huts to nearly 50,000 residents, occupying modern flats with gas stoves and hot running water, and small concrete balconies where families hung their laundry and grew geraniums in summer. It was, by Soviet standards, a genuinely pleasant place to live. The average age of its inhabitants was only 26, because the plant preferred young engineers and fresh technical graduates. And so the city had a cheerful, youthful atmosphere, full of strollers, school bags, and teenagers with cassette players. There was a palace of culture called Energetic, a cinema called Prometheus, a music school, 2 sports halls, a dozen kindergartens, and a brand new amusement park on the edge of town, with a small Ferris wheel that had been painted bright yellow and was scheduled to open for the first time on May 1st, the great Soviet labor holiday. The Ferris wheel had been tested already, with the operators riding it themselves and laughing at how small the city looked from the top. But no paying guests had yet ridden it, and the yellow gondolas stood patiently in a neat, colourful row, waiting for the ribbon cutting that would never truly come. The sky above Pripyat in late April was the particular kind of soft, clean sky that northern latitudes show for only a few weeks each year. When winter has gone and the dust of summer has not yet risen from the fields, migrating birds passed overhead at night, calling to one another in chains across the stars. In the apartment blocks, windows stood partly open to let in the fresh air, and the curtains moved gently in the night breezes. In one flat on Lenin Avenue, a young mother rocked a newborn baby to sleep. In another, a plant engineer who worked the night shift smiled to himself as he laced his boots by the door, looking forward to a calm Saturday evening at the reactor, where, he had been told, a routine electrical test was scheduled to be performed on Reactor 4. He kissed his wife on the forehead, told her he would be home for breakfast, and closed the door softly behind him so as not to wake the child. Across the city, in 100 other flats, similar small scenes played out. An older couple watched the evening news with the volume turned down low. A grandmother stirred borscht on a gas ring and listened to the radio humming softly about an upcoming football match. A group of friends finished their dinner in a cafe near the Cultural Palace and planned, without urgency, to go dancing the next night. No one was afraid. There was no reason to be afraid. The plant had been running safely for years. The Soviet press called nuclear energy peaceful atom, a phrase that appeared on posters in classrooms and in the pages of children's magazines. And most people in Pripyat believed, with a quiet, settled confidence, that the reactors a few kilometers to the north were among the safest machines ever built, watched over by some of the finest engineers in the world. They slept, or prepared to sleep, beneath a sky that was still a soft slate blue long after sunset. The clouds above Reactor 4, moving slowly westward on a mild spring wind. At the plant itself, inside the long, windowless hall of Unit 4, the atmosphere was different, though outwardly just as calm. Fluorescent lights buzzed in the corridors. The polished floors carried a faint mineral smell that was always there, part ozone, part lubricating oil, part something cleaner and sharper that was hard to name. Men in white overalls and soft fabric caps walked between control panels, taking readings and making notes, their footsteps echoing in the vast spaces between the machines. The reactor hall itself was cavernous, with its enormous concrete lid, known as Eleanor, gleaming dully under the lights. A disk of alternating grey and steel-coloured plates over 12 metres wide, beneath which lay the burning heart of the reactor. There were walkways and cranes, and a forest of yellow and black pipes and cables, and the air was warm and dry. And always, there was the steady, deep hum of turbines spinning somewhere in the distance, the sound that for those who worked here had become almost like silence. The shift that night would hand over at midnight to a new crew, and that new crew would carry out, in the small, quiet hours of the morning, an electrical experiment that had been on the plant's schedule for months. There was nothing particularly ominous about the plan. It was the sort of test that had been done elsewhere in the Soviet nuclear program. And on the surface, it seemed modest. Its official purpose was to determine whether, in the event of a sudden loss of external electrical power, the slowing turbines of the reactor could generate enough residual electricity to run the essential emergency systems for a brief window of time, a window of perhaps a minute or less, during which backup diesel generators could start up fully. It was a safety test, an experiment intended to make a very safe machine a little bit safer still. Few of the men preparing to carry it out had any sense that this quiet evening, on a Friday, drifting into Saturday, was to be the last ordinary night their city would ever have. The children of Pripyat slept. The cooling pond reflected a thin slice of moon. A nightingale sang somewhere in the pine forest between the plant and the river. A watchman lit a cigarette on the far side of the turbine hall and blew smoke up into the stars. And in the cold, patient steel body of Reactor 4, something that would, within a few hours, become one of the most infamous machines in human history, waited for the hands of men to begin turning its dials. Before we follow them into that fateful room, though, we should pause, take a long breath, and widen our view. We should look at the world that made Chernobyl possible, the long, strange story of Soviet power that produced this city, this plant, and this test on this particular night. Because what happened that spring morning was not only the result of a few switches thrown in the wrong order. It was the result of decades of ambition, fear, pride, secrecy, and hope. It was the culmination of a century in which human beings had learned to split the atom, to build vast industrial empires, to reach toward the stars, and also to keep enormous truths hidden from one another. To understand what the hum of that reactor meant, we must understand the country that had built it. And to understand the country, we must go back a little further still, walking gently through the decades, until we can see the shape of the whole extraordinary world that held its breath around Reactor 4 on the night of April the 26th, 1986. To picture the Soviet Union in the spring of 1986, imagine a country as wide as a continent, stretching from the cold Baltic shores near Finland all the way to the shores of the Pacific, where Vladivostok looked across the sea toward Japan. It contained 15 republics, more than 100 languages, deserts and tundras and mountain ranges and ancient cities with onion-domed churches, collective farms and sprawling industrial combines, and something like 280 million citizens who carried red passports stamped with the hammer and sickle. Its leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, had come to power only 13 months earlier, still a relatively young man by the standards of Kremlin politics, and he had already begun to speak in a softer, more hopeful tone than his predecessors. There were two words he used often, and those two words would come to define the era: glasnost, meaning openness, and perestroika, meaning restructuring. He believed the Soviet system could be reformed from within, made more honest, more efficient, more humane, without letting go of its socialist foundations. It was a cautious spring of tentative hopes, and many ordinary people could sense, in small ways, that something in the atmosphere had begun to change. Yet the Soviet Union was not, in 1986, a country that found it easy to let go of its habits. It had grown up through decades of war, revolution, famine, terror, and finally, enormous industrial expansion. And those long years had left deep patterns in its bones. One of the deepest of those patterns was the habit of secrecy. Bad news traveled slowly in the Soviet Union, if it traveled at all. Accidents in factories were classified. Industrial disasters were redrafted into local footnotes. Even weather reports could, in certain circumstances, be censored. The authorities believed, in an almost instinctive way, that the calm surface of public life must not be disturbed by unpleasant news, and the population, over 2 generations, had learned to read between the lines, to piece together rumor and silence into their own private estimates of the truth. Jokes in kitchens were more truthful than headlines on state television, and every adult knew it. When something went wrong, people expected that the first official statement would either deny it, downplay it, or quietly redefine it into something more comfortable. This habit, so old, so deep, so ordinary, would matter enormously in the days and weeks after Reactor 4 broke open. Nuclear power was a particular point of pride for this country. The Soviet Union had built the world's first nuclear power station to supply electricity to the grid. The small Obninsk plant, as far back as 1954, and in the decades that followed it, had constructed dozens more. The peaceful atom, as Soviet propaganda liked to call it, was held up as proof that the Soviet mind was not merely good at making weapons, but could also master the most complex science to serve human welfare. Posters in schools showed smiling children surrounded by friendly drawings of atoms, like cheerful little solar systems, orbiting around slogans about light and warmth for all. The atomic industry was a matter not just of engineering, but of ideology. Its achievements were celebrated in films, in postage stamps, in the curricula of technical schools, and its engineers were treated as a kind of aristocracy of reason, men and women who had apparently tamed the same force that had ended the war in the Pacific and turned it to the service of bread and light. Among the reactors most prized by the Soviet nuclear program was the one installed at Chernobyl, the RBMK, a complicated acronym that translated roughly as high-power channel-type reactor. The RBMK was a distinctly Soviet invention, unlike the pressurized water reactors favored in most Western countries. It used graphite as a moderator, which meant that the heat of the reaction took place inside long vertical channels that ran through a massive lattice of carbon blocks. Water was pumped up through these channels to be turned into steam, and the steam drove the turbines that generated electricity. The design had certain attractive features from the Soviet point of view. It could be fueled while running, which meant the plant did not have to be shut down for months at a time to change its fuel rods. It could be built in very large sizes, producing 1,000 megawatts or more of electrical power per unit. And it could use uranium fuel that had not been as highly enriched as in many Western designs, which fit neatly into the Soviet industrial base. But it also had flaws. Some of those flaws were known, even in 1986, to a small circle of specialists. The RBMK had what engineers called a positive void coefficient of reactivity at low power. That is, in certain operating conditions, if the cooling water inside the channels began to boil into steam, the reaction would speed up rather than slow down, because the graphite moderator kept the neutrons moving, while the steam, being far less dense than water, absorbed fewer of them. In a reactor, where the fuel and the moderator are locked tightly together, this is usually not dangerous, but in the particular geometry of the RBMK, under unusual conditions, it could become very dangerous indeed. There were also peculiarities in the design of its control rods. The long graphite-tipped absorbers that could be dropped into the core to quench the reaction. Before the boron at the bottom of those rods could begin its work of slowing the reaction, the graphite tips first displaced water from the lower part of the core, which, again, could briefly push reactivity upward. Most of the time, none of this mattered. The reactor was operated within its safe envelope, far from the awkward edges of its behavior. But on the night of the accident, that envelope would be crossed. Why was it crossed? To answer that, we must step into the world of the plant's leadership and into the particular emotional climate of Soviet heavy industry. The director of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant was Viktor Brukhanov, a careful, cautious man who had spent his career in electrical engineering and had been chosen to build the plant from scratch in the early 1970s. Under him worked Nikolai Fomin, the chief engineer, and Anatoly Dyatlov, the deputy chief engineer for operations. Dyatlov was a veteran of the Soviet naval reactor program, a small, sharp, demanding man who had survived a serious radiation accident years before, when a submarine reactor had malfunctioned during a test, and he had absorbed a dose high enough to end the careers of many of his colleagues. He carried that experience with him. He was brilliant, brusque, and unafraid of risk, and he had a reputation for dominating control room conversations in a way that younger operators did not easily contradict. Around these senior men worked shift foremen, senior reactor control engineers, turbine specialists, chemists, dosimetrists, computer technicians, and hundreds of other professionals, most of them young, many of them graduates of the best technical institutes in Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, and Kharkov. They lived in the apartments of Pripyat, walked their children to school in the morning, met friends for beer and chess in the evenings, and took the bus each day along a neatly paved road that ran through the pine woods to the plant. Their lives were comfortable by the standards of the time. They had access to goods that were hard to find in the rest of the country, and they enjoyed the respect due to those who worked in what was called a strategic enterprise. Many of them had come specifically for those privileges. Many had also come simply because they believed in what they were building. The safety culture at the plant was, by the standards of the time, not unusually bad. Drills were performed, paperwork was filed, procedures were written down in thick binders. In practice, though, certain habits had grown comfortable. Deadlines were respected more than instructions. An experiment scheduled to be finished before a certain date had to be finished before that date because the Soviet industrial plan expected it. Small deviations from rules were often tolerated if the operators believed they knew what they were doing, and the operators at Chernobyl were confident, sometimes more confident than they should have been. Above all, nuclear safety was seen as a matter for specialists, not for the public. The details of accidents, even quite serious ones, were kept inside the industry. A partial meltdown at Leningrad in the 1970s, an explosive release of radiation at Mayak back in 1957, a near miss somewhere else. These were stories that moved in whispers through the community of engineers, but that ordinary citizens of the Soviet Union, including those living in Atomgrads, generally did not know. People believed in the safety of the peaceful atom because no one had ever told them anything else. In the days leading up to the accident, the plant was preparing for what was supposed to be a routine maintenance shutdown of Reactor 4. Before the reactor was taken offline, the operators wanted to complete a long-planned test. The idea of the test had been circulating through the Soviet nuclear industry for years, because RBMK reactors, like all nuclear reactors, needed a reliable supply of electricity for their cooling pumps, even when the reactor itself was stopped. If the external grid were lost, diesel generators on site were supposed to spin up and take over. But diesel generators are not instantaneous, or they need around 40 seconds to reach full power. During those 40 seconds, something else would have to feed the pumps. The proposed answer was to use the rotational momentum of the turbines themselves. A turbine, even after steam has stopped driving it, continues to spin for a while because of its huge mass. And that spin, coupled to a generator, produces electricity on a declining curve. The test was meant to prove that the turbine's slowing spin could produce enough power to run the essential pumps for long enough to bridge the diesel gap. The test had been tried before at Chernobyl and at other stations, with mixed results. Modifications had been made to the voltage control systems, and now the engineers wanted to try again. It was not a nuclear test in the usual sense. On paper, it involved mostly electrical equipment. The reactor was supposed to be at a fairly low power level, around 700 megawatts thermal, when the test was performed. And in this condition, the reactor itself was not supposed to require any unusual interventions. For the operators, it was less a physics experiment than a set of electrical measurements. The bureaucracy treated it likewise. The detailed program for the test did not receive the full review from nuclear safety authorities that later investigators would argue it should have received, and it contained gaps and ambiguities that the operators were expected to close on the fly. On April the 25th, the day before the explosion, the shutdown sequence began. The reactor's power was gradually lowered throughout the day, and various experimental sensors were connected. Then, in the afternoon, something unexpected happened. The regional electricity dispatcher in Kyiv, facing an unforeseen demand, asked the plant to delay the shutdown and keep Reactor 4 running at partial power for several more hours. The operators complied. The reactor stayed at around 1,600 megawatts thermal, less than half its usual output, for some 9 hours longer than planned, while the grid worked through the evening peak. During those 9 hours, an important chemical process was taking place inside the fuel. A fission product called xenon 135 began to build up in concentrations higher than those of normal steady operation because it was forming slightly faster than it was being burned out. Xenon 135 is a powerful neutron absorber. The more of it there is in the fuel, the more difficult it becomes to sustain the reaction, and the more control rods must be withdrawn from the core to keep the power level where it is wanted. By the time Kiev finally released the plant to continue its shutdown at around 11 o'clock that night, the reactor was, in the language of nuclear engineers, already poisoned. The operators did not yet know how deeply. They were, however, tired, behind schedule, and keenly aware that the window for performing the test was closing. The new shift, the night shift, had not been trained specifically for the test. The procedures had been written with the previous day shift in mind. Briefings were hurried. Pages of instructions with handwritten crossouts were passed from hand to hand. Dyatlov, who had come in specifically to supervise, gave curt orders in the control room, where the atmosphere had tightened considerably. At about midnight, in the early minutes of April the 26th, the reactor's power was taken down further, from about 1,500 megawatts thermal toward the target range of around 700 megawatts. But the combination of xenon poisoning and an error in the automatic regulation system caused the power to fall much further than intended. For a moment, it was only around 30 megawatts thermal, barely idling. Faced with this, the operators had a choice. The standard safety rule was that if the reactor was taken below a certain threshold in this condition, it should be shut down and left to recover for many hours. But shutting it down would mean losing the chance to do the test before the maintenance outage, and that, in turn, would mean problems in the plant's internal politics. A postponement that Dyatlov in particular did not want to accept. Instead, he ordered the operators to bring the power back up. That decision is at the heart of what happened next. To raise the power of a xenon-poisoned RBMK reactor, the operators had to withdraw the control rods further than the safety regulations allowed. By the time Reactor 4 was stabilized at around 200 megawatts thermal, far below the target for the test, the number of rods left in the core was dangerously small. The reactor was now operating in a configuration that the designers had never considered safe. Its protective buffer of absorbing rods was largely gone. Its positive void coefficient, normally tamed by thick, water-rich cores and careful procedures, was now far more exposed. Its automatic shutdown thresholds had been lowered or bypassed. Warning lights blinked here and there on the consoles, and certain alarms had been silenced to avoid confusion during the test. In the corners of the control room, tension tightened like a wire. And it was in this condition, at around 1 o'clock on the morning of April the 26th, with the turbine test scheduled to begin only a few minutes later, that the men of the Chernobyl night shift looked at their panels, adjusted their headphones, took a breath, and prepared to follow a written procedure into a region of behavior that no one had ever mapped. The control room of Unit 4 was a long, narrow space filled with pale, steady light. Along the walls, panels after panel rose nearly to the ceiling, each one covered in small black dials, white switches, recording drums, and rows of indicator lamps that blinked or glowed in gentle colors: white, amber, red, and a pale, watery green. The largest panel of all, facing the shift foreman's desk, showed the state of the reactor itself, its control rods drawn as vertical lines climbing or descending above a schematic of the core. In front of the panels were 3 padded swivel chairs, each facing its own console. The senior reactor control engineer, a 25-year-old graduate named Leonid Topchinov, sat at the reactor desk. Beside him Alexander Akimov, the shift foreman of Unit 4, moved from panel to panel, clipboard in hand, giving calm instructions to his team. Behind them, standing near the back of the room, Anatoly Dyatlov watched with his arms crossed, occasionally stepping forward to speak sharply. At 1:23 in the morning, after the reactor had been stabilized at around 200 megawatts thermal, Akimov gave the order to begin the test. He reached for the chart recorder and pressed the button that marked the start of the experiment. Topchunov logged the time. At almost the same moment, another operator closed the stop valves to the turbine, cutting off the steam supply. The great turbine, suddenly deprived of its driving force, began to slow down, and its generator, still connected to some of the plant's internal power systems, began to produce the declining electrical curve the engineers wanted to measure. So far, so planned. The test was underway. Instruments scrolled, pens scratched on paper. Fluorescent tubes buzzed softly overhead. The reactor, still running at its reduced power, continued to hum in the vast hall below. But something had begun to shift in the core. With the turbine closed off, the flow of feed water into the reactor changed. The temperature of the coolant rose slightly. Tiny bubbles of steam, which the engineers called voids, began to form and grow more rapidly in the channels at the core's lower edges. And because the RBMK in this degraded configuration had a strongly positive void coefficient, each additional bit of steam pushed the reaction a little bit harder. Power began to climb. For perhaps 20 seconds it climbed slowly, so slowly that none of the men in the control room seemed alarmed. Then, suddenly, it began to climb faster. Topchunov noticed first, a tightening of his attention as he watched the power indicator edge upward past 300 megawatts. Akimov, walking across the room, paused beside him. Dyatlov, sensing something, moved forward as well. Seconds ticked. At about 1:23 and 40 seconds after midnight, Akimov gave the order that was supposed to be the safe end of every reactor experiment. "Press AZ5, he said. AZ5 was the emergency protection button, the large, mushroom-shaped switch, whose function was to drive every single control rod into the core and stop the reaction immediately. Topchunov reached forward and pushed it. In theory, the reactor should have shut down within 2 to 3 seconds. In practice, something very different happened. As the rods began to descend, the graphite tips entered the core first, displacing water in the lower channels and temporarily increasing reactivity there. Combined with the already positive void coefficient, the inserted rods, instead of calming the reaction, gave it one last savage push. Power began to rise with terrifying speed, 10 times normal, 100 times. The indicators on the panels stopped being accurate. The rods themselves, partway down their paths, seized in place as the fuel channels distorted from the sudden heat. Inside the core, the effect was almost instantaneous on a human timescale. In the space of a few seconds, the fuel pellets inside the rods reach temperatures at which uranium dioxide begins to melt, crack, and disintegrate. The fragments rushed into contact with the coolant water, which flashed instantly into high-pressure steam. The steam pressure in the cooling channels soared far beyond anything the pipes had been designed to hold. Pipes ruptured, channels burst. The pressure wave traveled upward through the reactor structure, lifting the enormous 2,000-ton concrete lid and its steel plates. In the control room, the men heard a sound they later struggled to describe. A great, rolling thud, followed by what felt like the earth itself shrugging. The floor lurched. Lights flickered. Ceiling panels moved. Dust fell from somewhere unseen. A second, even more powerful detonation followed 2 or 3 seconds later. A mixture, some investigators later believed, of hydrogen produced by the reaction of overheated steam with zirconium cladding and air rushing in to meet exposed graphite and fuel. The roof of the reactor building blew out. The great concrete lid, called Eleanor, tilted and settled askew. A column of white-hot debris, dust, and flaming graphite was flung high into the night sky above Pripyat. The first explosion blew pieces of the reactor across the plant yard. The second sent burning graphite blocks, each the size of a bread loaf, raining down onto the roofs of neighboring buildings. Red-hot fragments of uranium fuel, small as gravel or larger than fists, scattered across the roof of Reactor 3, which was still running at full power only a few dozen meters away, and onto the machine hall and the buildings of the adjacent cooling systems. A deep, angry glow rose from the torn-open shell of Reactor 4, a dark radiance like the inside of a furnace viewed through smoke. Steam, dust, and an eerie ionized light rose together into the sky. And then, slowly, the debris began to settle back as a fine grey ash over the pines, the roads, and the fields. In the control room, the men could not see any of this. The power had cut on some of their displays. Steam hissed somewhere behind the walls. Dust drifted down. Alarms began to sound in layered overlapping patterns. The reactor, they thought, must have experienced a major accident, perhaps a rupture of a pressurized pipe or a steam explosion in the drum separators. Akimov ordered emergency procedures. Topchunov, his face pale, tried to understand what the instruments now showed. Dyatlov stepped to the center of the room and began to bark orders with the rigid self-control of a man who has survived emergencies before. But some of the instruments were simply useless. The radiation monitors in the control room maxed out immediately, their needles pinned against the highest possible reading, which was only 1,000 microroentgens per second, corresponding to less than 4 roentgens per hour. The real levels were many thousands of times higher. Elsewhere in the building, the story was already unfolding at other speeds. Deep in the circulating pump room near the reactor, a man named Valery Kodymchuk, a young technician who had been on duty, was at that moment directly beneath the collapsing structure. The blast buried him instantly. His body would never be recovered. A short distance away, another worker, Vladimir Shashinok, was pinned under falling debris, his back broken and his body scalded by bursting steam. Colleagues found him almost at once and carried him out on a stretcher. He would die in the medical unit a few hours later, the first official Chernobyl fatality. The lights in the reactor hall flickered and then failed. Water sprayed from broken pipes. Emergency lighting cast long, nervous shadows on the concrete walls. Smoke curled from corners. Men coughed, ran, called to one another through the noise. Some realized almost at once what had happened. Others, trained never to think the unthinkable, believed stubbornly for many minutes that the reactor itself must still be intact. In the little fire station on the plant grounds, the first alarm sounded within minutes of the blast. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, a 23-year-old officer with a wife and a new baby daughter at home, took command of the initial response. A second unit, under Lieutenant Viktor Kibanok, raced in from Pripyat a few minutes later, its siren howling across the sleeping city. The men climbed hastily into their gear, grabbed their helmets and boots, and swung themselves onto the red fire trucks. They did not know what they were driving toward. Their duty orders spoke only of a fire at the nuclear plant, probably in a turbine hall. There was nothing in their training or in their equipment that could have prepared them for what they were about to face. They had heavy canvas coats and leather gloves and simple cotton masks. They had no dosimeters that could measure the level of radiation they would walk through. They had courage, discipline, and a sense that fires, wherever they came from, must be put out. At the plant, they found a scene of raw, almost unreal devastation. Pieces of roof were flung wide across the yard. Smoke and steam rose from a dozen places. The wall of Reactor 4 was split open on its upper face, like a great stone loaf torn in half, and an orange glow, deeper than any ordinary fire, pulsed from within, scattered across the roof of the reactor building and onto the adjacent roof of Unit 3. They could see black and glowing lumps that looked, at first, like chunks of burning coal. These were fragments of graphite from the reactor core, still hot, and more importantly, still fiercely radioactive. The firefighters' task, as they understood it, was to put out the scattered small fires burning on the roofs before they could spread to other parts of the plant, and especially to prevent any fire from reaching Reactor 3, which must not be allowed to join Reactor 4 in whatever had happened. They ran their hoses, unfolded their ladders, and climbed. On the roof of Reactor 3, they worked in a dust that coated their uniforms within minutes. The air shimmered. A metallic taste filled their mouths. Many of them reported a strange flavor, almost sweet, that they could not place. Some began to feel unwell almost at once, dizzy, nauseous, with a burning in their throats. But they kept working. Lieutenant Pravik, in particular, stayed on the roof as long as he could, his hoses directed at fragments of burning debris. A few of the men carried chunks of graphite with their hands to the edges of the roof to kick them off, not understanding that each chunk was delivering lethal doses to them through their gloves. They worked for hours. Gradually, the fires on the roofs were brought under control. In the open pit that had once been the reactor hall, though, the graphite core itself continued to burn. Nothing they had could touch that. Inside the building, the plant's own fire brigade, led by a man named Leonid Telyatnikov, fought its own battles with the blaze. Telyatnikov, a stocky, determined officer in his mid-30s, coordinated the various detachments, directed hoses into the machine hall to protect the remaining turbines, and helped evacuate injured workers. He would later become one of the most celebrated figures of that night, though at the time he was simply a man doing his job in a building he believed could still be saved. Firefighters waded through pooled water and kerosene-slick corridors, coughing in smoke and steam, their faces blackened, their pulses pounding. Many of them had not yet realized that the air they breathed was full of radioactive iodine, cesium, and countless short-lived products of a shattered reactor core. Back in the control room, messages flew in from around the plant. Chief Engineer Fomin, roused from sleep by a frantic telephone call, arrived in a blur of confusion and barked orders. Director Brukhanov, also called at home, drove through the dark city and reached the plant just as the first reports of the explosion were crystallizing. Yet even as these senior men began to gather information, they found themselves trapped in the gap between what was physically happening and what they could allow themselves to believe. Brukhanov telephoned Moscow to report an accident at Unit 4. and described it as a major fire. He did not say the core had been destroyed. He was not yet certain of it. Fomin, shouting into a separate phone line, insisted that the reactor was intact and that cooling water must be pumped in to keep it safe, even though the reactor no longer had the physical form needed to contain coolant at all. Dyatlov, who had already been exposed to a lethal dose and was beginning to feel it, still believed that much of the destruction he had seen could be explained by a burst drum separator. Men were sent on errands into the heart of the ruined building, errands that amounted to death warrants, so that the supervisors could confirm what their minds still refused to accept. Two of those men, Alexander Kudryavtsev and Viktor Proskuryakov, trainee operators, were ordered by Dyatlov to go into the reactor hall itself and manually drop the rods that had jammed during the scram. They went. They climbed through darkened corridors into a space where the ceiling was torn open to the sky, where shattered concrete and fuel rubble lay across the floor, where the orange glow of the burning core was visible through the broken lid. They saw immediately that the reactor was not merely damaged. It was not there in the way it had been a few minutes earlier. They turned and ran back to report. Both of them absorbed doses that would kill them within weeks. In the streets of Pripyat, 3 kilometers away, almost nothing had changed. A few residents had woken at the sound of the explosion, thinking perhaps that a boiler had burst, or that the weather had turned, or that a distant plane had broken the sound barrier. Some went to their balconies and looked out over the dark trees toward the plant. A column of smoke and colored light hung above Reactor 4, lit from below by flames. Pale, unreal, strangely beautiful. Some of them stood and watched for a long time. One group of residents walked together along the railway bridge that overlooked the plant, drawn by curiosity, and stood in the gentle spring breeze, talking softly, pointing. The air around them grew heavier with invisible particles with each passing minute, though none of them could see or feel it. The bridge would later be known, in the darker corners of folklore, as the Bridge of Death, though the real fates of those who stood on it are more complicated than legend sometimes suggests, a matter we will return to later. And above all of this, above the shattered reactor, the helmeted firefighters, the pale watchers on the bridge, the sleeping children and the humming turbines of Unit 3 that still turned on their oiled shafts, above the pines and the Pripyat River and the yellow gondolas of the Ferris wheel, waiting for their first paying riders. The spring wind blew slowly northwest, toward Belarus, toward the Baltic Sea, toward the sleeping cities of Scandinavia. It carried with it a fine, invisible cargo, the first atoms of an event whose consequences would ripple outward for generations. The night was still dark. The dawn, when it came, would find the world already subtly, permanently different, though almost no one alive at that hour yet realized it. In every great disaster, there is a narrow strip of time in which ordinary people, with ordinary lives, stand suddenly at the frontier between the known world and a new one that does not yet have a name. At Chernobyl, that strip of time began in the first minutes after the explosion and did not fully close for several days, and it was crowded with the quiet, astonishing labor of people who, without quite deciding to, carried on their chosen trades in the middle of a nightmare. The first of these, as we have seen, were the men of the immediate crew, Valery Kodymchuk, the the circulating pump operator entombed in his own workplace, became the first of the Chernobyl dead almost at the moment of the explosion itself. He was 35, with a wife and 2 children, and he had been proud of his steady work in the pump rooms, that low, humming place where water the color of pale tea moved through thick pipes on its way up into the core. A small commemorative plaque would later be installed on the outside of the entombed reactor, inscribed with his name, the only one of the Chernobyl dead, whose body lies permanently inside the structure that killed him. Vladimir Shashanok, the second fatality, an adjustment engineer, was carried out of the ruined building by colleagues whose own skin was already beginning to burn from the dust on his clothes. He died before dawn of combined injuries in the plant's medical unit, and his kind-hearted face, preserved in the family photograph his widow would treasure for decades, became one of the first quiet faces of the disaster. Then there were the firefighters. Lieutenant Vladimir Pravik, 23, led the first crew onto the roof of Reactor 3. His young wife, Nadezhda, herself only a few months into motherhood, had stayed up late with their baby and heard the sirens passing through Pripyat. She would not see her husband conscious again. Lieutenant Viktor Kibanok, 23 as well, married only a short time before, led the second truck. The third unit, arriving from the Pripyat Fire Brigade, included several men whose names the world would come to know in the later telling: Nikolai Vashchuk, Nikolai Titanok, Vasily Ignatenko, Vladimir Tishura. Each of them bore a particular story, a particular corner of ordinary Soviet life, and each of them climbed without hesitation onto the burning roofs that night, because that was what duty asked of them. Vasily Ignatenko, for example, was a tall, quiet man from a Belarusian village, 25 years old, a sports enthusiast, a keen young fireman who had once dreamed of competing in cross-country skiing. His wife, Lyudmila, a slender young woman with soft brown hair, had been at home in their apartment that night, waiting for him to come back from his shift because he had promised to take her to their garden plot the next morning. She had heard the distant boom, felt the window glass vibrate gently in its frame, and noticed the strange lights moving in the sky to the north. She had wondered briefly whether lightning had struck the plant. She had gone back to bed. When she learned, hours later, that her husband had been taken to the hospital, she would begin one of the most remarkable personal journeys of the entire disaster. A story that decades later would be recorded with gentle precision by the writer Svetlana Alexievich in the opening pages of her book, Voices from Chernobyl. We shall come back to Lyudmila. By around 3 a.m, the main flames on the roofs of the plant had been brought under control. Pravik, Kibanok, and many of their men were already showing symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, though they were not yet fully aware of what was happening to them. Their faces were flushed. Their gums tingled. Their skin felt strangely tight, as if they had spent an afternoon in the sun. Several were vomiting beside the trucks. An ambulance carried them one by one to the Pripyat medical station, where the staff, drawn out of their beds by the emergency, quickly realized they had no protocol for anything of this size. The men were stripped of their contaminated uniforms, washed, given fluids, placed on stretchers. By dawn, many were being loaded onto helicopters and airplanes bound for the specialized hospital in Moscow, known as Hospital Number 6. the only facility in the Soviet Union with dedicated wards for severe radiation injury. At Hospital Number 6, a small, calm, determined physician named Angelina Guskova presided over the radiation clinic. She had treated radiation casualties from Soviet reactor incidents and nuclear submarine accidents for decades, and she recognized at once, when the first Chernobyl patients arrived, that she was looking at something of a scale she had never seen before. The men came in waves. Some could still walk. Others arrived on gurneys, already visibly declining. Their doses were measured when possible, estimated when not. Some had absorbed radiation equivalent to 10, 15, 20 times the lethal threshold. Their gastrointestinal linings were disintegrating. Their bone marrow was failing. Their skin, within a few days, would begin to slough away in great sheets like melted wax. There was almost nothing that medicine, as it then stood, could do against injuries of such magnitude. Guskova and her staff could only relieve pain, prevent infection where possible, and sit with their patients through the slow process of their dying. Lyudmila Ignatenko arrived in Moscow within days. She was told, gently but firmly, that her husband was a radiation patient, that he was no longer her husband in the ordinary physical sense, that he was effectively a living reactor. She was warned that she, if pregnant, would risk losing her child if she went into his ward. She was pregnant, though she did not tell them. She stayed anyway. She cared for Vasily in the days that followed, holding his hand when his hand was still there to hold, bringing him tea and fruit he could not eat, reading to him when his eyes could no longer focus, washing him when his skin began to fail. She later described how the smell in the ward was like nothing she had ever known. He died on May 13th, 17 days after the explosion. She would give birth to a daughter some months later, a tiny, fragile girl who survived only a few hours. The child would be said by some doctors to have absorbed, in a sense, the radiation that might otherwise have damaged the mother. A second, healthy son would be born to her years later. But Lyudmila's memories of those weeks in Moscow Hospital Number 6 would remain, for the rest of her life, the central furniture of her inner world. The firefighters were not alone in their sacrifice. At the plant itself, in the hours after the explosion, operators who understood the severity of what had happened continued to work. Akimov and Toptunov, the shift foreman and the senior reactor control engineer, stayed at their posts long past the moment when they could have walked away. They waded through contaminated water in flooded corridors, trying to reach hand-operated valves that they believed would let coolant into the shattered core. They did not yet know that the core was gone, not in the sense they understood. They did know that they were in a place deadly beyond measurement, and they stayed. Both men would die of acute radiation syndrome within weeks. Both would carry in their last days the quiet conviction that they had done their duty. Other operators went out onto the roof with them or into other parts of the building. One of them, a man named Alexander Lelichenko, an electrical engineer with decades of experience, repeatedly walked through intensely contaminated, hydrogen-filled rooms to prevent a fire from reaching storage tanks that would have worsened the disaster catastrophically. He shielded younger colleagues by taking the worst of the work himself. He was 47. He would be dead within 2 weeks. The dosimetrists too have their place in this story. Dosimetrists were the plant workers whose job it was to measure radiation levels. On the night of April the 26th, the dosimetrists of Unit 4 found themselves attempting the impossible. Their instruments had been designed for the small, ordinary excursions of a functioning reactor, and most of them were limited to ranges far below what the accident had produced. When technicians tried to read the yard with their standard meters, they found the needles slammed against the stops. More powerful instruments, capable of measuring the real levels, were kept in safes whose keys were held by specific supervisors. And some of those supervisors were in town or asleep. Alexander Loginov, a senior dosimetrist, took a more capable instrument, walked across the plant grounds, and recorded readings that he knew must be accurate, even though his supervisors told him they could not be. He reported levels of 200 Röntgens per hour and higher in places. He was told he must be mistaken. He insisted he was not. He was right. Back in the control room, Akimov's handwriting on the test log, neat and disciplined at the start of the shift, grew looser as the hours went on. His face was pale. His lips were swollen. He drank water, sat down briefly, then stood up again and kept working. He had not yet allowed himself to believe what his eyes had already begun to accept. Somewhere around 4 a.m, Dyatlov, who had been on the run through the building for hours, finally began to show symptoms severe enough that colleagues helped him out of the control room and toward the medical unit. He would survive, though only after a long and complex illness. He would later be tried in a Soviet court for violations of nuclear safety regulations and would go to prison for several years, dying in 1995, still insisting in his memoirs that the accident had been caused by defects in the reactor rather than by the actions of the operators. Later investigations would conclude that both were true. The reactor had dangerous flaws, and the operators had driven it into a state that exposed those flaws fatally. Dawn came gently to Pripyat on the morning of April the 26th. It was a Saturday. The sun rose through a faint golden haze, and many families, unaware, prepared to send their children to school or to enjoy a quiet weekend. The plant, visible from parts of the city, was shrouded in smoke, but not in any way that seemed alarming to ordinary eyes. Gardeners watered their tulips. Fishermen walked toward the cooling pond with rods over their shoulders. Children pushed their bicycles out of apartment lobbies and headed toward the park. A wedding was held in a registry office that morning. The bride and groom posed for photographs in front of a mural. They would remember years later how the sunlight had that day a particular silvery quality, and how a fine, powdery dust seemed to drift down from the sky now and then, like the first dandelion seeds of summer, though the dandelions had not yet bloomed. By mid-morning, however, the plant's internal measurements had begun to circulate quietly among senior officials. The levels in places near Unit 4 were not merely high, but astronomical. Director Bryukhanov, under pressure from Moscow, still insisted in some communications that the reactor vessel was intact. Others, including the plant's civil defense chief, were already persuaded otherwise. The regional authorities in Kiev and beyond were informed. Army and police units began to move quietly toward the area. A column of buses began to gather, unannounced, on the outskirts of the town. The machinery of the Soviet state was, in its characteristic way, waking up behind the curtain. Carefully, secretly, determined not to alarm the public before the leadership had decided what to say. The citizens of Pripyat, oblivious, continued with their Saturday. Children played football on the dusty square outside the Palace of Culture. A young couple pushed a pram toward the riverside promenade. A group of schoolboys in matching blue uniforms went for a long bicycle ride along the road that led toward the plant, turning back only when a militia officer, unusual on that road, waved them away without explanation. The Ferris wheel continued to stand in the new amusement park, its yellow gondolas still waiting. And the wind, so gentle it could barely be felt, continued to carry its invisible burden up and away from the city, away over Belarus, away across Europe, away into a future that was beginning to take shape. Silently, in the upper air, in the days that followed the explosion, two simultaneous stories unfolded, and for a long time, they did not touch. One was the story of the disaster itself, the physical plume of radiation spreading outward on the spring winds, and the countless small decisions being made by men and women who worked, quite literally, at the edge of death. The other was the story of what the Soviet state chose to say about it, which is to say, at first, almost nothing. Those two stories grew apart rapidly in the first 48 hours, and then collided with such force that the collision itself became one of the hinges on which the rest of the century turned. Within the plant, the scale of the accident became undeniable to the technical staff, long before it became publicly acknowledged. By the late morning of April 26th, samples taken from debris on the roofs confirmed the presence of fuel particles. That meant the reactor core itself had been breached. No other conclusion was possible. This information was transmitted in carefully worded telephone conversations to Moscow, where it rose quickly through the layers of the Central Committee apparatus. Boris Sherbina, a deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, was tapped to head an emergency government commission. Beside him travelled Valery Legasov, the first deputy director of the Kurchatov Institute, one of the Soviet Union's most eminent physicists, a precise and thoughtful man whose face, in photographs taken that week, already carries a shadow of what he was learning. They flew south on the afternoon of April the 26th and arrived in Pripyat by evening, joining an expanding group of engineers, medical experts, and army officers who had been pouring into the town from across the country. They set up their headquarters in the White Party building on Lenin Square, the Ispolkom, whose windows looked out over the central square of Pripyat. From that building, Sherbina directed the emergency response through the night. Legasov, in a role that would ultimately consume him, tried to assemble a physical picture of what had happened. He walked near the reactor, saw the glow, measured doses, listened to the plant engineer's initial accounts, and quickly concluded that the danger was still enormous and still active. The core was burning. Roughly 2,000 tons of graphite were on fire at the bottom of what had been the reactor vault. With each hour, the fire pumped more radioactive material into the atmosphere. Something had to be done, yet nothing in Soviet doctrine or in world engineering practice had prepared anyone for the precise challenge in front of them: extinguishing a graphite fire inside a ruined nuclear reactor from the outside, without killing the men involved. Their chosen solution was, in the event, improvisational and costly. Beginning on April the 27th, helicopters were sent to hover above the open reactor vault and drop loads of sand, boron, lead, clay, and dolomite into the pit. The boron was meant to absorb neutrons. The sand and clay were meant to smother the burning graphite. The lead was meant to act as a shield and, when melted, to flow into gaps and seal them. Over the next week or so, the pilots, many of them young officers with no nuclear background, flew thousands of missions, loading their machines with sacks of materials and hovering for as long as they could stand the heat, the dust, and the invisible heat of the radiation below. The doses they absorbed in those flights were enormous. Some of them would die within months. Others would struggle for years with blood disorders and cardiovascular diseases. One helicopter, striking a cable strung from a nearby construction crane, crashed into the ruined plant some weeks later, killing 4 crewmen instantly. That accident, captured on film, became one of the most widely circulated images of Chernobyl's rescue operation. Meanwhile, the city of Pripyat slept through April 26th into the afternoon of the 27th, almost as if nothing had changed. On the Saturday, schools were held, shops opened, families went about their usual errands. The daylight had a strange clarity. A fine metallic tang settled on the tongue of anyone who stood outside too long, though most people attributed it to the nearby industrial activity. The official radio, when it was on at all, spoke of a small incident at the power plant. Nothing to be concerned about. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the Ispolcom, a decision was being made that would change these quiet streets forever. Shabina, listening to radiation specialists and civil defense officers, concluded that Pripyat must be evacuated. The thresholds of radiation in the streets had risen far past safe limits, and continued exposure for children in particular was intolerable. But he chose to delay the evacuation until the following afternoon to avoid panic and to allow logistics to be organized. That delay, in the judgment of many later experts, added measurably to the total dose received by the city's children. The evacuation itself, when it came, had the efficiency of a long-planned drill executed by an experienced state machine. On the morning of April the 27th, loudspeakers mounted on police cars and military vehicles began to drive slowly through the streets of Pripyat, broadcasting a simple message. Attention, dear comrades. Because of an accident at the nuclear power plant, unfavorable radiation conditions have developed in the city. A temporary evacuation of residents is being organized. Take documents, essential belongings, and food for 3 days. The return, it was said, would take place within a few days, certainly no more than a week. Pets, residents were told, should be left behind. They would be cared for. In all, about 1,100 buses had been gathered during the night from surrounding regions and were parked in a great convoy that stretched along the highway for kilometers. The people of Pripyat, in the hour that followed, packed with the peculiar false calm of those obeying an order they do not fully understand. Children were dressed in their best clothes because their parents wanted them to look respectable for the trip. Photographs, documents, and a few books were placed in small suitcases. Dogs were tied in yards with extra food and water, and gentle words from children who, for the most part, believed they would return in days. Grandmothers insisted on packing a favorite tablecloth. Fathers took last looks at half-finished shelves and workshops. Married couples locked the doors of their flats with the care of people going on a short holiday. Then they went downstairs, stood in orderly queues, and boarded the buses. The convoy began to move around 2 in the afternoon. It took about 3 hours for the entire city to empty. By evening, Pripyat was a silent geometry of empty apartment blocks and empty streets, broken only by stray dogs that did not understand why their people had gone. From that day, the city would not be a city again in the ordinary sense. Its residents were dispersed across collective farms, sanatoriums, hotels, and temporary dormitories in Kyiv and the surrounding villages. Many assumed for weeks that they would be returning. In the event, they would not. Within a few weeks, it became clear that Pripyat was contaminated too heavily for habitation on any reasonable timescale. The doors of the apartments were sealed. The shops were emptied of their remaining goods. The Ferris wheel, which had been scheduled to open for May 1st, never opened. A 30-kilometer radius around the plant was declared a closed exclusion zone, and checkpoints manned by soldiers appeared on every road leading in or out. Around 120,000 people, ultimately, would be evacuated from that zone, and from a larger area that was added in the weeks that followed. Those numbers would swell in later years as new measurements identified additional zones of severe contamination across Belarus and Russia as well. Yet even as the evacuation proceeded, the Soviet state had still not informed the outside world of the accident. For roughly 48 hours after the explosion, the Soviet Union told the rest of the world essentially nothing. A brief, 4-sentence TASS announcement appeared on the evening of April the 28th, and it was only a few lines long, mentioning a plant accident and measures being taken. The real news came from abroad, far to the north, in Sweden, on the morning of April 28th. A worker arriving at the Forsmark nuclear power plant set off the radiation monitors as he came in through the security turnstile. Forsmark was a careful Swedish facility that used strict access control, and the discovery of radioactive contamination on a worker's clothing before he had entered any radioactive area was so puzzling that the management suspected their own plant of having suffered a leak. They evacuated most of the staff and began a detailed search. When they could find no internal source, they turned their instruments outward. They measured the ground. They measured leaves and rainwater. They identified specific isotopes, particularly iodine 131 and cesium 137, which could only come from an operating reactor that had suffered a significant accident. They checked the weather. The wind had been coming out of the southeast, from the direction of the Soviet Union. They began to make inquiries. By that afternoon, Swedish diplomatic channels were pressing Moscow directly for information. Meteorologists across Europe were comparing notes. Radiation monitoring stations from Finland to West Germany were reporting elevated readings. The truth, which Moscow had hoped to keep within its own borders, was arriving at European newsrooms in the form of measurements taken by Swedish engineers 1,000 kilometers from the source. Only then, cornered by public evidence, did the Soviet Union issue its short acknowledgement. Even that acknowledgement said little. For several more days, Pravda and Izvestia carried only brief mentions of an incident, carefully worded, without photographs, without names, without scale. Meanwhile, the 1st of May approached, and the Soviet Union prepared, as it did every year, to celebrate International Workers' Day with vast parades across every major city. In Kyiv, roughly 100 kilometers south of Chernobyl, the wind had shifted in the days after the explosion, and plumes of radioactive material had drifted over the Ukrainian capital. Local authorities, under orders from Moscow to maintain public calm and not disrupt the holiday, went ahead with their parades. Children in white dresses carried flowers along the boulevards. Young men marched with banners. Families stood on the curbs to watch. Photographs from that day would later horrify the generation that saw them, because they would come to represent, more powerfully than any monument, the moment when an entire political culture, confronted with something it could not hide and would not admit, chose ceremony over the safety of its own children. In the countryside, the story was different, quieter, and in some ways even grimmer. Across the farms of northern Ukraine and southern Belarus, no one had been told anything. Cows grazed in fields where the grass was now laced with short-lived radionuclides. Children drank the milk those cows produced. Families ate wild strawberries and mushrooms gathered from forests, now gently sprinkled with cesium. Thyroids began to absorb iodine, 131 from milk at alarming rates, especially in small children. In the silence that Moscow maintained for most of those first weeks, an invisible dose was laid down that would, years later, manifest as a sharp rise in thyroid cancer among those who had been young in 1986, a rise that would eventually produce, by the mid-1990s, one of the clearest epidemiological signatures ever observed. The full television address from Gorbachev did not come until May 14th, 18 days after the explosion. By then, the world already knew, in broad outline, what had happened. Gorbachev spoke for nearly half an hour. He described the accident, praised the heroism of the firefighters and the liquidators, and acknowledged the failures of communication. He also, in passing, blamed elements of the Western press for exaggeration and anti-Soviet propaganda. But the address was, for Soviet television, unusually candid, and for many viewers inside the country, it was the first full confirmation that a major disaster had occurred. The age of glasnost had been given by the accident, a test it could not refuse, and the age of glasnost in turn now required an official narrative of what had happened and why. That narrative, in its first form, concentrated on human error. The Soviet report presented to the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna in August 1986, delivered by Valery Legasov himself, argued that a combination of violations of procedure by the operators had led the reactor into a configuration in which its otherwise safe design had been driven beyond tolerable limits. Legasov's presentation was praised internationally for its technical clarity. Inside the Soviet Union, however, the story was already being resisted by engineers who pointed out the dangerous peculiarities of the RBMK's own design. The positive void coefficient, the graphite-tipped control rods, the insufficient safety margins written into its operating procedures. Over the following years, investigations would return to those design flaws again and again, and the picture would come to include both the actions of the operators and the features of the reactor. In the meantime, the immediate task was simply to contain the disaster physically. The graphite fire burned for about 10 days, slowly dying down as the helicopter drops accumulated tons of material inside the reactor vault, and as the available fuel was consumed. By the middle of May, the open glow from the vault had mostly vanished. The invisible emissions to the atmosphere had dropped sharply, but the reactor remained a gaping sore in the landscape, still full of fuel, still capable of producing further releases if rain soaked into the ruins, or if fires flared up beneath the debris. Something would have to be built around it. That something would, over the next months, become the sarcophagus. And around the sarcophagus, in a widening ring of effort, a new kind of human population was already beginning to gather. A population defined by a single word that had not, until that spring, carried its modern meaning. Liquidators. The word liquidator came into Russian and Ukrainian use after Chernobyl with a specific, almost medicinal meaning. A liquidator, in the language of the post-accident state, was any person drawn into the work of cleaning up, containing, decontaminating, or rebuilding around the destroyed reactor. In the end, or by different counts, between 600,000 and nearly 1 million people would pass through that definition during the years that followed. Soldiers and miners, civil engineers and railway workers, bus drivers and cooks, nurses and helicopter pilots, geologists and radiation technicians, teachers and young conscripts fresh from basic training. They all, in one way or another, joined the great human machinery that rose around the ruined plant. They were given simple equipment, brief instructions and duties that often lasted only a few minutes or a few hours, because in many cases, that was as long as a human being could safely work. Then they were rotated out, counted, sometimes honored with a small medal, and sent home with a small certificate, and often a cascade of medical questions that would follow them for the rest of their lives. Their first great work, after the evacuation of Pripyat and the quieting of the core fire, was to tame the land around the plant itself. In the immediate vicinity of Reactor 4, pieces of fuel and graphite had been scattered across the roofs, grounds, and adjacent forests. Some of those pieces glowed at levels that would kill an unprotected human within hours. Liquidators in lead-lined aprons, with simple dosimeters pinned to their collars, moved through the rubble, gathering the worst of the debris by hand, sweeping, brushing, spraying a special sticky decontaminant that trapped dust on the ground and could later be rolled up like a carpet. Entire layers of topsoil were scraped away with bulldozers and buried in trenches. Buildings were washed repeatedly. The nearby forest, whose pines had absorbed so much radiation in the first days that their needles had turned a violent brick red, was cut down and buried in place. That part of the woodland became known as the Red Forest. And although the trees grew back over the years in a lower, scruffier form, the land beneath them still registered elevated dose rates decades later. The largest single piece of work, however, was the roof of Reactor 3. Scattered across that roof were blocks of graphite and fragments of fuel whose dose rates were so high that no wheeled robot could operate there for long. Several attempts were made with West German, Japanese, and Soviet remote-controlled vehicles. Their electronics were fried by the radiation within minutes. Faced with the failure of machines, the liquidators adopted, almost reluctantly, the only approach left: human beings. Young soldiers, mostly reservists called up from their civilian lives, were brought in, given lead vests cobbled together in haste, helmets with visors, and heavy gloves. They were told that their work would last only a matter of seconds. Each of them had a single task: to pick up 1 or 2 fragments of graphite, carry them to the edge of the roof, and throw them back into the reactor crater below. They ran out, bent down, lifted their piece, ran a few steps, and threw. Then they ran back down the stairs and were replaced. They became known, half jokingly and half grimly, as biorobots, because they were doing with their bodies what the real robots could not. Over several weeks, perhaps 3,000 of them cleared the roof in this way. None of them served more than a few shifts. The quiet heroism of that specific repeated act, the run, the bend, the lift, the throw, remains one of the most astonishing concentrations of ordinary human courage in the 20th century. While the biorobots worked above, another group of liquidators was hard at work below. Engineers had raised a new fear that the molten mass of fuel and concrete forming beneath the reactor, the so-called corium, a bubbling slag of uranium oxide, zirconium, concrete, and sand from the helicopter drops, might burn its way downward, crack the lower containment slab, and reach the water-filled suppression pools beneath the reactor. If that happened, a new steam explosion might scatter radioactive material far more widely than the original accident. To eliminate this risk, the pools were drained by plant workers who waded through dark, dripping corridors in diving suits to open manual valves. 3 of those men, Alexei Ananenko, Valery Bezpalov, and Boris Baranov, later became the subject of an enduring myth in the West, the story of the 3 suicide divers who supposedly knew they were volunteering for certain death. The reality, recorded in their later interviews, was more restrained and, in its own way, more touching. They walked through the corridors in light protective gear, not dive suits. The water they waded through was cooler than rumor made it. They completed their task in perhaps 20 minutes and walked back out. All 3 received significant doses, but all 3 lived on for years afterward, with Ananenko and Bezpalov surviving well into their 70s. Baranov, the oldest, died in 2005 of heart disease. They were, in short, not martyrs in the dramatic sense. They were calm men who did a careful job under frightening conditions. Their story, as it really happened, is in many ways more inspiring than the legend. A further danger came from below still. Once the pools had been drained, engineers worried that the corium might yet reach the groundwater if it burned through the last concrete floor. To guard against this, a team of coal miners, drawn from the Donbass and the Moscow basin, was brought in to tunnel under the reactor. Their task was to dig a horizontal shaft beneath the damaged unit and install a large heat exchanger under its base, filled with liquid nitrogen, which could cool any descending corium and freeze it in place. The miners worked in extraordinary heat because the structure above them radiated warmth, and in extraordinary conditions because they could not risk the dust suppression water that would ordinarily be used in their trade, for fear of bringing contamination back up into the tunnel. They dug in their underwear, coughing, sweating, relieving each other every few hours. They finished the tunnel in an astonishingly short time. In the end, the heat exchanger was never even needed because the corium cooled on its own as it seeped down from the core and solidified it in the basements above the tunnel. But the miners, like the biorobots, had done their work, and many of them paid for it later with cancers and circulatory diseases of their own. The most visible physical result of all this labor rose slowly over the summer and autumn of 1986 as the sarcophagus, the ungainly, improvised tomb of steel and concrete that was thrown around Reactor 4 to contain the remaining fuel. Designed in haste and built by workers who often could spend only a few minutes at each task, the sarcophagus had gaps, cracks, and holes from its first day. It was intended to last for decades. Its designers knew it probably would not. Over the years, steel trusses rusted, concrete seals weakened, and small amounts of radioactive dust continued to escape. By the late 1990s, a consortium of international donors, led by European nations and the United States, had begun to plan a more lasting solution. A vast arched shelter, the new safe confinement, that would be built on rails a short distance away and then slid over the old sarcophagus like an enormous steel hood. That project, completed in 2016, produced the silver-grey dome that now dominates photographs of the plant. Beneath it, robots can slowly begin the work of dismantling the old structure. Decade by decade, century by century, as the radiation levels inside fall to safer ranges. While the engineers worked, the human beings who had once lived in Pripyat and in the many smaller villages inside the exclusion zone scattered across the country. Some of them accepted their new lives and built fresh homes in Kyiv or in distant cities. Others, particularly older women and a few older men, missed their native ground so deeply that they began, within a year or two, to return quietly to their villages, setting up house again in the very homes they had been told to leave. These returnees, known as the Samosli, the self-settlers, came back to gardens grown wild, barns full of last season's hay, stoves still cold from the final fires of April 1986. They planted potatoes. They kept chickens. They hunted and gathered wherever they could. The Soviet and later Ukrainian authorities tolerated them with reluctant kindness, bringing in deliveries of bread and fuel at regular intervals. Their numbers declined slowly as the years passed and the Samosli aged and died. By the mid-2020s, only a few dozen remained, a handful of old, stubborn souls whose lives read like a small, living folk tale about the stubborn persistence of home. The health consequences of the disaster were, and remain, a subject of careful scientific debate, and we should speak of them with the gentle precision that the topic requires. Of those exposed to the worst doses inside the plant and on the rooftops, roughly 30 people died from acute radiation syndrome within the first weeks and months. A somewhat larger group of severely exposed workers survived the acute phase, but went on to suffer long-term complications, including secondary cancers and cardiovascular diseases, at elevated rates. Beyond this relatively well-documented cohort, however, lay the much larger population of people exposed to lower doses across Ukraine, Belarus, and Russia, and the hundreds of thousands of liquidators who passed through the zone over the years that followed. Here the picture becomes statistical rather than individual. The clearest signal, by far, is an increase in thyroid cancers among those who were children at the time of the accident, particularly in Belarus, where the radioactive iodine reached high concentrations in milk. Thousands of such cancers have been recorded, and although most are treatable with modern surgery, they represent a sharp departure from the expected background rates. For other cancers, the signals are weaker, and distinguishing a Chernobyl effect from the noise of ordinary oncology is difficult. Different scientific bodies have arrived at different estimates of the total eventual death toll, ranging from a few thousand in the cautious numbers of United Nations committees to tens of thousands in less formal projections. What all the figures share is an admission that the true long-term cost will never be known with certainty. The disaster did not so much kill a particular identifiable group as it added a small distributed pressure to the health of millions of lives. The environmental consequences were similarly layered. In addition to the Red Forest, vast areas of Belarusian and Ukrainian farmland were contaminated with cesium-137 and strontium-90, isotopes with half-lives of roughly 3 decades. In some places, these would require generations to decay to levels considered safe for agriculture. Wild berries, mushrooms, and game animals continued for years to concentrate cesium in their tissues, and even in countries distant from the plant, such as the high pastures of Norway and Scotland. Sheep grazing on contaminated grass became a public health concern for decades. Yet nature also produced its own quieter, more hopeful surprises. In the absence of humans, the exclusion zone began to fill with wildlife. Wolves, lynxes, wild boar, elk, and most famously, the nearly extinct Przewalski's horses, reintroduced in the late 1990s, thrived in forests and meadows from which people had withdrawn. Herons nested on the cooling towers. Black storks settled in abandoned villages. Apex predators returned in numbers that surprised biologists. The Chernobyl zone became, strangely, one of the most interesting wildlife refuges in Europe, an accidental nature reserve whose inhabitants lived, it is true, with small chronic elevations in dose, but whose populations flourished in the absence of hunters, roads, and tractors. The political consequences reached even further. Chernobyl arrived at a moment when the Soviet Union was, beneath its outward steadiness, already strained. Economic growth had stalled. The war in Afghanistan was dragging on. Glasnost and perestroika were in their early, uncertain stages, and the public's willingness to trust official communications was beginning to erode. The accident, with its initial secrecy and its eventual forced openness, dramatically accelerated that erosion. Citizens who had been told that nothing was wrong learned, from foreign broadcasts and from the whispers of relatives, that something enormous had happened. They then heard their leaders, in time, confirm much of what had been rumored. It became harder, after that, for the government to hold the old line that inconvenient news should be managed. Gorbachev himself later wrote that he came to see Chernobyl as a turning point, the moment when the full scale of the system's rigidity and its inability to tell the truth about itself became unmistakable to him. Within 5 years, the Soviet Union was no more. The accident did not cause its collapse alone, but many historians would place it prominently among the events that helped to bring down the political structure that had built the reactor in the first place. Outside the Soviet world, the lessons were absorbed by every country with a nuclear industry. Reactor designs were modified where possible. Safety cultures were reviewed. International bodies, such as the International Atomic Energy Agency, gained new authority and new information-sharing mandates. The World Association of Nuclear Operators was created so that, in the future, incidents at one plant could be immediately understood and learned from at every other plant in the world. National regulators in Western countries tightened their oversight. A wave of caution swept through the global nuclear industry, slowing new construction for many years. In some countries, especially in continental Europe, public opinion turned sharply against nuclear power, and those political shifts would echo down to the referendum in Italy the following year, which halted that country's nuclear program, and to the gradual withdrawal of Germany from nuclear energy over the following decades, a decision only intensified by the later accident at Fukushima Daiichi in Japan in 2011. In other countries, such as France, nuclear power continued to expand, but within a more carefully scrutinized framework. Chernobyl, in short, did not end the atomic age, but it changed its weather. And there was one further, subtler consequence, which lived not in any law or institution, but in the minds of ordinary people around the world. Before Chernobyl, nuclear power had been, in many places, an essentially abstract idea. After Chernobyl, it was a place on a map. It was a ruined building, a silent city, a patch of forest turned red. It was a story of sleepy, late-night confusions and bright morning ambulances. It was Lyudmila at her husband's bedside, and a little Ferris wheel that had never been ridden. For almost everyone who was alive and aware in the spring of 1986, Chernobyl became, in some quiet corner of the imagination, a small permanent room, visited now and again, where the possibilities of human endeavor were weighed against the hard ground of their limits. And from that small room, over the years, would come countless further stories. It is those further stories, the quieter and stranger ones that sit behind the headlines, that we shall now turn to, because the world of Chernobyl is not only the world of the explosion, the liquidators, and the grand political consequences. It is also the world of 1,000 smaller details, each of them carrying its own reflection of the whole, and together making the long, patient landscape in which the disaster continues to live. There are many ways to tell the story of what came after, and no single telling can include everything. We will walk together through a wider gallery now, pausing at many doors, looking gently into rooms most headlines never entered, because the reach of Chernobyl is in those rooms as much as in any museum display or television documentary. Each story, on its own, is a small window. Together, they begin to give the shape of how the disaster took up residence in the world and quietly rearranged everything it touched. Begin with Pripyat itself, the model city that became the world's most famous empty place. After the evacuation of April 27th, 1986, the apartment blocks were sealed, but not immediately looted. For a short time, soldiers patrolled the streets to prevent returnees. Personal possessions remained where they had been left, kitchens half-tidied, toys scattered on floors, open books on bedside tables, calendars still showing April. In the years that followed, however, waves of unofficial visitors changed the shape of the city from within. The first looters were soldiers and officials themselves, quietly carrying away televisions, refrigerators, and small valuables. Afterward came more organized teams, picking up anything that could be cleaned and sold. The walls, the floors, the ceilings. These remained as they were, but the furniture was rearranged, thinned, shifted by countless invisible hands. Nature also came indoors. Pigeons nested in the school auditoriums. Moss crept along the tiled corridors of the Palace of Culture. Birch saplings, whose seeds floated on the wind, took root in the gutters of the apartment buildings and began to grow. Within 2 decades, the shape of Pripyat had changed again. The trees planted along the avenues had grown wild and tall. Roads were cracked with roots. Glass from broken windows glittered in the pavement cracks. The skyline that had once consisted of rectangular apartment blocks now rose from a green sea of forest that advanced further every spring. Schoolrooms were transformed into silent stages of drifted dust, with chalk still on the blackboards in some rooms, and paper posters still stapled to the walls. The swimming pool of the Palace of Culture, one of the finest in a Soviet town of its size, stood drained to a bowl of cracked blue tiles, visited occasionally by stalkers who left graffiti on its walls. In the amusement park, the yellow Ferris wheel rusted gently, one gondola tilted slightly, another missing a panel, its circular shape still recognizable from the main square. Children's paintings remained pinned to walls in the kindergartens. An old upright piano in a music school kept its keys, though most of its strings were long gone. Visitors came to call all these things the artifacts of a lost world, and in a way they were. though if you stood in one of those empty rooms for long enough, you could almost believe that the world was not lost, but paused, waiting. Around the ruined city, the larger exclusion zone unfolded into a patchwork. The official exclusion area, known in Ukrainian as the Zona Відчуження, the zone of alienation, covered roughly 30 kilometers in radius from the plant, though its precise shape was drawn around hotspots and wind patterns rather than a perfect circle. Within the zone lay dozens of smaller villages: Chistogalovka, Kopachi, Yanov, Leliv, Rasoka, Shepelichi, and many more. Some of these villages were bulldozed shortly after the evacuation, either because they stood too close to contaminated ground or because their wooden houses could not be effectively decontaminated. Their timbers were buried in great trenches, with only the cemeteries sometimes left standing above the fresh-filled earth, because the dead could not be re-evacuated. Other villages were left standing, slowly returning to the land. A traveler walking through such a village today will find orchards of apple trees growing through collapsed roofs, grapevines fallen across empty yards, a table still set in the kitchen of a house whose roof has long since fallen in, letting in the rain and the weather. Everywhere there are wildflowers, blue cornflowers, and white yarrow, growing from what used to be gardens. The Samosli, the self-settlers, whom we have already met, occupy their own tender place in this landscape. Most of them were older villagers at the time of the accident, people who had lived all their lives in their particular house, in their particular patch of land, and who had found it impossible to live elsewhere. Some went back within months, in defiance of official orders, carrying bundles through fields and past checkpoints. Others petitioned for formal permission and received it, more or less grudgingly, from authorities who recognized that forcing these elderly residents out again would produce grief out of proportion to the small risks involved. Their daily lives were, on the surface, a version of pre-war village routine. They kept chickens and goats, tended small gardens, drew water from their wells, and received occasional visits from medical inspectors who came to measure them and to exchange a few kind words. A writer from Kyiv named Irina Zagyadko spent years visiting them, recording interviews and photographing their homes, and her documentation preserved for the future a vivid portrait of how people choose home when they could choose anywhere else. One such woman was Maria Urupa, who returned to her village near the Pripyat River within weeks of the evacuation. She lived in a small wooden house, painted a pale blue, with a plank floor worn smooth by generations of bare feet, and she kept a single cow and a vegetable garden. She said that she had been born in that village, married in it, buried her husband in its cemetery, and intended to join him there. When visitors asked her whether she was not afraid of the radiation, she would smile with the particular patience villagers reserve for absurd city questions, and say that radiation could not be seen or smelled, and she knew how to live among things that could not be seen. Another Samosli, a man named Ivan Ivanov, returned to his house and kept it almost exactly as it had been in 1986, including a small calendar hanging on the wall that he never updated, and a teapot on the stove that he always boiled at the same time each afternoon. He said that he liked the silence. He said that the city, even when he had been there, had always seemed noisy to him, and that now he had, at last, the rare privilege of living in a place where the only sound was the wind and the distant calling of cranes. Both he and Maria died in the 2010s. Their houses stood empty for a little while, then began their quiet return to the Earth. Between the Somosley and the official presence of the zone, another population took shape. The unofficial visitors, the curious, the daring, the idealistic, who came to be known collectively as stalkers. The word was borrowed from the 1979 science fiction film Stalker by Andrei Tarkovsky, which itself had been based on a Strugatsky brothers novel called Roadside Picnic. In the film, a stalker is a man who guides travelers into a mysterious, forbidden zone full of strange phenomena and shifting landscapes. When, after the Soviet collapse, young adventurers in Ukraine and Belarus began to sneak through the fences and gates of the Chernobyl exclusion zone to explore its abandoned spaces. The parallel to Tarkovsky's vision was obvious, and the name stuck. These stalkers came for different reasons. Some were seeking something like adventure. Some were photographers or artists looking for unusual subject matter. Some were simply restless young people who wanted to visit a place that was, in every possible sense, elsewhere. They moved through the woods in small groups, sleeping in abandoned farmhouses, climbing onto the roofs of Pripyat apartment blocks at dusk to watch the sun go down over the forest, sharing their journeys afterward in online forums and small books. A particular culture grew up around these trips. Stalkers had their own etiquette. They did not break into sealed buildings where they could be avoided. They did not carry souvenirs away from the zone, on the grounds that the objects were contaminated and belonged where they were. They did not set fires in places with old timber or chemicals. They shared routes and hiding places in quiet conversations and carefully maintained maps. They respected the Somosley, often stopping at villages to drink tea or swap a little bread for local potatoes. They kept track, in their own way, of the dose rates they encountered, sometimes with small personal counters, sometimes with a general awareness of which patches of ground to avoid. In time, many of them became, in effect, citizen caretakers of the zone, aware of its changes from year to year in a way no official team ever had time to be. These informal tours eventually gave way to official ones. By the mid-2000s, the Ukrainian government had opened regulated day visits to Chernobyl for tourists, guided by licensed companies and accompanied by dosimeters and strict schedules. The industry grew slowly, then rapidly, especially after the release of the 2019 HBO miniseries Chernobyl, which introduced the story to a new global audience. In the late 2010s and early 2020s, many thousands of foreign visitors came each year, traveling by bus from Kyiv into the zone, walking through selected streets of Pripyat, posing in front of the Ferris wheel, looking up at the silvery dome of the new safe confinement from the approved distance. They returned home with photographs and a curious mixed feeling of awe, sadness, and gratitude for the quiet of their own ordinary lives. The tourism was halted in 2022 by the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the zone, for a time, would be occupied by soldiers rather than travelers. But we shall come to that later on. Even the plant itself continued to have a working life, at least for a while. Units 1, 2, and 3 at Chernobyl were not destroyed by the accident, and after intensive decontamination, the surviving reactors were brought back into operation within months. For 13 years after the disaster, electricity was still generated on the same concrete slab, where the worst peacetime nuclear accident in history had taken place. The staff lived in the newly built town of Slavutich, some 50 kilometers away from the plant, and commuted in each day on a special train that passed through Belarusian territory. They would put on white coveralls, pass through radiation screening, and spend their shifts at their consoles, now far more carefully monitored than in 1986. The long closure of the plant came gradually, in stages, under international pressure. Unit 2 was shut down after a fire in 1991. Unit 1 was closed in 1996. Unit 3, the last to operate, was powered down on December 15, 2000, in a televised ceremony attended by the Ukrainian president, the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and several international dignitaries. A worker turned a key. A dial moved. The plant went quiet. Around it, a landscape that had once pulsed with electricity settled into a new stillness, though the sarcophagus still held its difficult cargo, and the workers still had years of decommissioning work to do. Of all the strange turns that Chernobyl took, perhaps none is stranger, or more quietly beautiful, than what happened to its living creatures. In the weeks immediately after the accident, there was genuine death in the forests around the plant. The pine needles of the red forest turned that famous coppery orange, and small mammals, mice, shrews, voles, declined in numbers for a season. Birds that nested in the most contaminated patches raised fewer chicks than usual. Invertebrates in the upper soil layers were visibly affected. Scientists sent in from Moscow, later joined by international biologists, documented these effects with care, and for some time they predicted that the zone would become a biological wasteland for a generation or more. What happened instead surprised everyone. Within a few years, as the short-lived isotopes decayed away and the long-lived ones sank quietly into the soil, the ecosystems of the exclusion zone began to rebound. The absence of humans turned out, on balance, to be a far greater gift to wildlife than the presence of residual radiation was a curse. Roads fell silent. Fields went unplowed. Hunters were banned. Even smoke from household stoves disappeared from thousands of chimneys. Into this unexpected sanctuary crept, and then ran, and then galloped, creatures that had been squeezed out of their ancient ranges across the centuries. Wolves, which had declined to almost nothing in the populated Ukrainian countryside, found in the zone a near-perfect habitat. Recent studies have suggested that their density inside the exclusion zone is now higher than in any other region of Ukraine, and perhaps 7 times higher than in surrounding nature reserves, where hunting is technically restricted, but still sometimes practiced. Lynx returned. Bears, mostly absent from the area for decades, began to be sighted again in the forests of the northern zone. Elk and red deer grew numerous. Wild boar, that most adaptable of European creatures, found endless ground for rooting in abandoned gardens and orchards. In the late 1990s, a small group of Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse species in the world, was released into the zone as part of a conservation experiment. These horses, heavy-necked, dun-coloured, with dark, upright manes, had been extinct in the wild since the 1960s, surviving only in zoos and breeding centres. It was hoped that the quiet, unpeopled steppes and meadows of Chernobyl might give them a foothold. They took to their new home beautifully. Within a few years, wild foals were being born on the abandoned farmlands, and by the 2020s, the Chernobyl herd had grown into perhaps 150 animals. On clear days, tourists would sometimes catch sight of them from the road, grazing in a distant field, manes lifting in the wind. Their presence, in an area that had seemed too damaged for anything to thrive, was as powerful a symbol as any of the strange resilience of life. Birds, too, made the zone their own. Black storks, sensitive birds that prefer remote forests with undisturbed wetlands, nested along the old drainage canals. White-tailed eagles returned to fish in the cooling pond, whose waters, once used to moderate the reactors, had become one of the largest artificial lakes in Ukraine. Owls nested in the ruined roofs of villages. Cranes, those ancient ceremonial birds whose calls drift down from great heights in spring and autumn, were increasingly common. Photographers patient enough to sit in hides for hours could record intimate portraits of a European wilderness as rich, in its way, as the Białowieża forest far to the west. All of this did not mean that the radiation was harmless. Scientists studying the wildlife found measurable effects. Songbirds in the most contaminated areas sometimes had smaller brains and reduced carotenoid pigments. Bank voles showed signs of cataracts. Some populations of insects and spiders were markedly reduced in the worst patches. But at the landscape scale, the trade-off was clear. Where human pressure was absent, populations grew. Where it was present, even at low levels of radiation, they shrank. Chernobyl became, for ecologists, a profound natural experiment in the balance between two kinds of harm: the slow chemical harm of radionuclides and the fast, blunt harm of human activity. It taught them, without lecturing, that the second was often more powerful than the first. Scientific research in the zone extended far beyond wildlife. Radiochemists studied the movement of cesium through soils and into plants, refining their understanding of how different soil types, particularly peaty ones, could hold isotopes near the surface, where they could keep re-entering the food chain. Agronomists experimented with techniques to lower uptake of cesium into crops, adding potassium, for instance, which the plants absorbed preferentially, leaving the cesium behind in the soil. Medical researchers followed the thyroid cancer patients with care, finding, over years, that modern surgery and radioiodine treatment produced good outcomes for the vast majority, a quiet mercy amid the larger sadness. One very particular scientific curiosity came out of the depths of the sarcophagus itself. In the years after the accident, when engineers and physicists first ventured into the basement rooms where the corium had solidified, they found a strange, glassy black mass whose surface looked almost like flowing lava frozen in place. It had poured from the reactor vault, melted through grates and flooring, and come to rest in a configuration that gave it the somewhat dramatic name, the elephant's foot, because one large lobe did indeed look like a great calloused paw. It was, at first, incandescently dangerous. A person standing near it for a single minute in 1986 would have absorbed a lethal dose. Over the decades, though, as the shorter-lived isotopes within it decayed, its surface radiation levels fell, and it became possible to approach it for brief periods in protective gear, even to chip off small samples for analysis. Those samples revealed a remarkable material, a matrix of uranium dioxide, zirconium silicates, graphite, and melted structural sand, a composition that had never before existed on Earth, and that came to be called corium, or more picturesquely, lava-like, fuel-containing material. Scientists continue to study it, partly for the insights it gives into the behavior of molten fuel during severe accidents, and partly for the purely curious pleasure of examining a new kind of rock that had been cooked into being by a chain reaction. An even smaller, but perhaps stranger scientific discovery came to be called Chernobylite. In 1990, Soviet scientists examining samples of the lava-like materials inside the sarcophagus noticed an unfamiliar crystalline structure. It was a zirconium silicate, incorporating uranium, that did not match any known mineral. They named it Chernobylite, and for some years, it was regarded as a curiosity unique to the ruined reactor. Eventually, however, later studies found it present in trace amounts in certain natural geologic environments under the right conditions. Still, the story of how a mineral could take its name from a disaster, describing matter created by human error, was a small, unsettling reminder of the extraordinary chemistry that had taken place in those few seconds of April 26th. The zone became a destination for scientific instrumentation of every kind. Drones with radiation sensors mapped the plumes across the forests in ever finer detail, discovering hotspots that had been missed by ground teams. Isotope analysis traced Chernobyl fallout across thousands of kilometers, into the glaciers of the Alps, into the sediments of Scandinavian lakes, into the soils of Welsh hillsides. Sheep farmers in parts of Wales, Scotland, and the Lake District in northern England found that their animals were picking up cesium from the heather and bracken. An official monitoring of Welsh lamb continued for nearly 3 decades after the accident, before restrictions were finally lifted. The detection of Chernobyl traces in distant landscapes became, in a way, its own quiet memorial, a reminder that no reactor explosion is ever entirely confined to its own valley. Human science, though, extended beyond the technical and into the medical and psychological. Researchers followed cohorts of evacuees for years, tracking not only their physical health, but also their mental and social adjustment. They found, as one might expect, increased rates of anxiety, depression, and certain psychosomatic conditions among those who had been displaced, especially those who had been unable to make satisfying new lives elsewhere. These effects, often grouped under the term chronic psycho-emotional stress, were in many cases as damaging to individuals' lives as any detectable physical effect. This was not a comfortable discovery. It suggested that the true harm of a disaster like Chernobyl did not arise only from the atoms it scattered across the fields, but also from the way it rearranged the inner lives of those who had lived in its shadow. Later generations of public health experts would take this lesson into the response to Fukushima and other events, paying far more attention to the social fabric around displaced populations, trying, where possible, to keep communities intact during evacuation and resettlement. Then there were the quieter, more specific human stories that never made it into the big reports, but gave their own flavor to the zone. The elderly beekeeper, for instance, who continued to tend his hives inside one of the villages, and whose honey, tested many times over the years, was reported by the monitoring agencies as falling within permissible radiation levels, a fact he took as a point of pride. The retired teacher in a nearby town who kept, over the years, a quiet archive of letters from children who had been evacuated from Pripyat, collecting them for decades in brown paper envelopes, sorting them by year, writing small notes in the margins of the letters to indicate later news of marriages, deaths, children of children. The ornithologist who every spring made a pilgrimage to a particular willow thicket beside the Pripyat River to listen for the song of the great snipe, a bird whose numbers had risen steadily since the departure of the farmers. The amateur archaeologist who mapped and catalogued the forgotten little cemeteries scattered through the zone, many of them dating to before the First World War, their crosses leaning and their names half-eaten by lichen, each one an older layer of memory beneath the newer tragedy. Gradually, over the decades, the zone filled with this kind of slow, small, intimate meaning. It did not become empty of human story. It became, in fact, crowded with it, though the stories were no longer those of the people who had once lived in its flats and farms. They were the stories of those who came after. The scientists, the Samosli, the stalkers, the tour guides, the ecologists, the beekeepers, the visiting writers, and, in their own quiet way, the wolves and the horses and the storks. It was as if the land, relieved of the heavy obligation of everyday life, had been taken up by a different set of attentions and was becoming, against all expectations, one of the most closely observed patches of ground in Europe. Among the nearly 750,000 liquidators who passed through the zone in the years after the accident, certain individual stories have lingered in the public memory, either because of their dramatic outlines or because writers and filmmakers caught hold of them and shaped them for later audiences. It is worth walking slowly through a handful of those lives, because they reveal, better than any statistical summary, what the disaster actually meant at the scale of one person at a time. Consider Vasily Mikhailenko, a young mechanical engineer from Kharkov who had graduated only the year before the accident and was called up to serve as a reservist in the summer of 1986. He was sent to work on the sarcophagus, where his job involved welding steel plates onto the outside of a structure being assembled piece by piece. He was issued a lead apron, gloves, and a small dosimeter, whose readings, he noticed, sometimes did not match what his more experienced colleagues whispered about the dose rates in their section of the site. He worked for roughly 90 days, mostly in short shifts of no more than 10 or 15 minutes at a time, followed by rest periods far from the worst areas. He returned to Kharkov at the end of the summer, married his fiancée as they had planned, and went into civilian engineering. Over the following decades, he developed, in succession, hypertension, a cardiac arrhythmia, cataracts, and then, in his 50s, a form of leukemia that was successfully treated, but which left him with a permanent sense that his body had been put on a clock whose rate was slightly faster than his contemporaries. He attended liquidator reunions, gave occasional interviews, raised 3 children, loved grandchildren whose photographs he carried in his wallet, alongside a small worn card identifying him as a participant in the liquidation of the Chernobyl accident. His story was, in most respects, an ordinary one among the liquidators, though not ordinary at all by the standards of a non-liquidator life. Of all the strange turns that Chernobyl took, perhaps none is stranger or more quietly beautiful than what happened to its living creatures. In the weeks immediately after the accident, there was genuine death in the forests around the plant. The pine needles of the red forest turned that famous coppery orange, and small mammals, mice, shrews, voles, declined in numbers for a season. Birds that nested in the most contaminated patches raised fewer chicks than usual. Invertebrates in the upper soil layers were visibly affected. Scientists sent in from Moscow, later joined by international biologists, documented these effects with care, and for some time they predicted that the zone would become a biological wasteland for a generation or more. What happened instead surprised everyone. Within a few years, as the short-lived isotopes decayed away, and the long-lived ones sank quietly into the soil. The ecosystems of the exclusion zone began to rebound. The absence of humans turned out, on balance, to be a far greater gift to wildlife than the presence of residual radiation was a curse. Roads fell silent. Fields went unplowed. Hunters were banned. Even smoke from household stoves disappeared from thousands of chimneys. Into this unexpected sanctuary crept, and then ran, and then galloped. Creatures that had been squeezed out of their ancient ranges across the centuries. Wolves, which had declined to almost nothing in the populated Ukrainian countryside, found in the zone a near-perfect habitat. Recent studies have suggested that their density inside the exclusion zone is now higher than in any other region of Ukraine, and perhaps 7 times higher than in surrounding nature reserves, where hunting is technically restricted, but still sometimes practiced. Lynx returned. Bears, mostly absent from the area for decades, began to be sighted again in the forests of the northern zone. Elk and red deer grew numerous. Wild boar, that most adaptable of European creatures, found endless ground for rooting in abandoned gardens and orchards. In the late 1990s, a small group of Przewalski's horses, the last truly wild horse species in the world, was released into the zone as part of a conservation experiment. These horses, heavy-necked, dun-coloured, with dark, upright manes, had been extinct in the wild since the 1960s, surviving only in zoos and breeding centres. It was hoped that the quiet, unpeopled steppes and meadows of Chernobyl might give them a foothold. They took to their new home beautifully. Within a few years, wild foals were being born on the abandoned farmlands, and by the 2020s, the Chernobyl herd had grown into perhaps 150 animals. On clear days, tourists would sometimes catch sight of them from the road, grazing in a distant field, manes lifting in the wind. Their presence, in an area that had seemed too damaged for anything to thrive, was as powerful a symbol as any of the strange resilience of life. Birds, too, made the zone their own. Black storks, sensitive birds that prefer remote forests with undisturbed wetlands, nested along the old drainage canals. White-tailed eagles returned to fish in the cooling pond, whose waters, once used to moderate the reactors, had become one of the largest artificial lakes in Ukraine. Owls nested in the ruined roofs of villages. Cranes, those ancient ceremonial birds whose calls drift down from great heights in spring and autumn, were increasingly common. Photographers patient enough to sit in hides for hours could record intimate portraits of a European wilderness, as rich, in its way, as the Białowieża forest far to the west. All of this did not mean that the radiation was harmless. Scientists studying the wildlife found measurable effects. Songbirds in the most contaminated areas sometimes had smaller brains and reduced carotenoid pigments. Bank voles showed signs of cataracts. Some populations of insects and spiders were markedly reduced in the worst patches. But at the landscape scale, the trade-off was clear. Where human pressure was absent, populations grew. Where it was present, even at low levels of radiation, they shrank. Chernobyl became, for ecologists, a profound natural experiment in the balance between 2 kinds of harm: the slow chemical harm of radionuclides and the fast, blunt harm of human activity. It taught them, without lecturing, that the second was often more powerful than the first. Scientific research in the zone extended far beyond wildlife. Radiochemists studied the movement of cesium through soils and into plants. refining their understanding of how different soil types, particularly peaty ones, could hold isotopes near the surface where they could keep re-entering the food chain. Agronomists experimented with techniques to lower uptake of cesium into crops, adding potassium, for instance, which the plants absorbed preferentially, leaving the cesium behind in the soil. Medical researchers followed the thyroid cancer patients with care, finding, over years, that modern surgery and radioiodine treatment produced good outcomes for the vast majority, a quiet mercy amid the larger sadness. One very particular scientific curiosity came out of the depths of the sarcophagus itself. In the years after the accident, when engineers and physicists first ventured into the basement rooms where the corium had solidified, they found a strange, glassy black mass whose surface looked almost like flowing lava frozen in place. It had poured from the reactor vault, melted through grates and flooring, and come to rest in a configuration that gave it the somewhat dramatic name, the elephant's foot, because one large lobe did indeed look like a great calloused paw. It was, at first, incandescently dangerous. A person standing near it for a single minute in 1986 would have absorbed a lethal dose. Over the decades, though, as the shorter-lived isotopes within it decayed, its surface radiation levels fell, and it became possible to approach it for brief periods in protective gear, even to chip off small samples for analysis. Those samples revealed a remarkable material, a matrix of uranium dioxide, zirconium silicates, graphite, and melted structural sand, a composition that had never before existed on Earth, and that came to be called corium, or more picturesquely, lava-like, fuel-containing material. Scientists continue to study it, partly for the insights it gives into the behavior of molten fuel during severe accidents, and partly for the purely curious pleasure of examining a new kind of rock that had been cooked into being by a chain reaction. An even smaller, but perhaps stranger scientific discovery came to be called Chernobylite. In 1990, Soviet scientists examining samples of the lava-like materials inside the sarcophagus noticed an unfamiliar crystalline structure. It was a zirconium silicate incorporating uranium that did not match any known mineral. They named it Chernobylite, and for some years it was regarded as a curiosity unique to the ruined reactor. Eventually, however, later studies found it present in trace amounts in certain natural geologic environments under the right conditions. Still, the story of how a mineral could take its name from a disaster, describing matter created by human error, was a small, unsettling reminder of the extraordinary chemistry that had taken place in those few seconds of April 26th. The zone became a destination for scientific instrumentation of every kind. Drones with radiation sensors mapped the plumes across the forests in ever finer detail, discovering hotspots that had been missed by ground teams. Isotope analysis traced Chernobyl fallout across thousands of kilometers, into the glaciers of the Alps, into the sediments of Scandinavian lakes, into the soils of Welsh hillsides. Sheep farmers in parts of Wales, Scotland, and the Lake District in northern England found that their animals were picking up cesium from the heather and bracken, and official monitoring of Welsh lamb continued for nearly 3 decades after the accident, before restrictions were finally lifted. The detection of Chernobyl traces in distant landscapes became, in a way, its own quiet memorial, a reminder that no reactor explosion is ever entirely confined to its own valley. Human science, though, extended beyond the technical and into the medical and psychological. Researchers followed cohorts of evacuees for years, tracking not only their physical health, but also their mental and social adjustment. They found, as one might expect, increased rates of anxiety, depression, and certain psychosomatic conditions among those who had been displaced, especially those who had been unable to make satisfying new lives elsewhere. These effects, often grouped under the term chronic psycho-emotional stress, were in many cases as damaging to individuals' lives as any detectable physical effect. This was not a comfortable discovery. It suggested that the true harm of a disaster like Chernobyl did not arise only from the atoms it scattered across the fields, but also from the way it rearranged the inner lives of those who had lived in its shadow. Later generations of public health experts would take this lesson into the response to Fukushima and other events, paying far more attention to the social fabric around displaced populations, trying, where possible, to keep communities intact during evacuation and resettlement. Then there were the quieter, more specific human stories that never made it into the big reports, but gave their own flavor to the zone. The elderly beekeeper, for instance, who continued to tend his hives inside one of the villages, and whose honey, tested many times over the years, was reported by the monitoring agencies as falling within permissible radiation levels, a fact he took as a point of pride. The retired teacher in a nearby town who kept, over the years, a quiet archive of letters from children who had been evacuated from Pripyat, collecting them for decades in brown paper envelopes, sorting them by year, writing small notes in the margins of the letters to indicate later news of marriages, deaths, children of children. The ornithologist who every spring made a pilgrimage to a particular willow thicket beside the Pripyat River to listen for the song of the great snipe, a bird whose numbers had risen steadily since the departure of the farmers. The amateur archaeologist who mapped and catalogued the forgotten little cemeteries scattered through the zone, many of them dating to before the First World War, their crosses leaning and their names half-eaten by lichen, each one an older layer of memory beneath the newer tragedy. Gradually, over the decades, the zone filled with this kind of slow, small, intimate meaning. It did not become empty of human story. It became, in fact, crowded with it, though the stories were no longer those of the people who had once lived in its flats and farms. They were the stories of those who came after: the scientists, the Samosli, the stalkers, the tour guides, the ecologists, the beekeepers, the visiting writers, and, in their own quiet way, the wolves and the horses and the storks. It was as if the land, relieved of the heavy obligation of everyday life, had been taken up by a different set of attentions, and was becoming, against all expectations, one of the most closely observed patches of ground in Europe. Among the nearly 750,000 liquidators who passed through the zone in the years after the accident, certain individual stories have lingered in the public memory, either because of their dramatic outlines or because writers and filmmakers caught hold of them and shaped them for later audiences. It is worth walking slowly through a handful of those lives, because they reveal, better than any statistical summary, what the disaster actually meant at the scale of one person at a time. Consider Vasily Mikhailenko, a young mechanical engineer from Kharkov who had graduated only the year before the accident and was called up to serve as a reservist in the summer of 1986. He was sent to work on the sarcophagus, where his job involved welding steel plates onto the outside of a structure being assembled piece by piece. He was issued a lead apron, gloves, and a small dosimeter, whose readings, he noticed, sometimes did not match what his more experienced colleagues whispered about the dose rates in their section of the site. He worked for roughly 90 days, mostly in short shifts of no more than 10 or 15 minutes at a time, followed by rest periods far from the worst areas. He returned to Kharkov at the end of the summer, married his fiancée as they had planned, and went into civilian engineering. Over the following decades, he developed, in succession, hypertension, a cardiac arrhythmia, cataracts, and then, in his 50s, a form of leukemia that was successfully treated, but which left him with a permanent sense that his body had been put on a clock whose rate was slightly faster than his contemporaries. He attended liquidator reunions, gave occasional interviews, raised 3 children, loved grandchildren whose photographs he carried in his wallet, alongside a small, worn card, identifying him as a participant in the liquidation of the Chernobyl accident. His story was, in most respects, an ordinary one among the liquidators, though not ordinary at all by the standards of a non-liquidator life. In Kyiv, in Minsk, in Moscow, in the offices of the International Atomic Energy Agency in Vienna, the slow institutional work around Chernobyl continued even as the war ebbed and flowed. Funds for the long-term decommissioning of the plant were renegotiated. New monitoring stations were installed around the zone to detect any unusual radiation movement. The Samosli in their small villages reported, through intermediaries, on the noises they had heard during the occupation, the planes overhead, the fires in the distant forests. Wildlife biologists, whose long-term studies had continued for years, noted how herds of Przewalski's horses had been disturbed from their usual grazing patterns, and how certain bird species had moved to new areas. All of this, layered over all of the earlier layers, added yet another geologic band of memory to the zone, another ring of story in a place that already had more rings than any other stretch of forest or farmland in Europe. Meanwhile, in more peaceful corners of the wider world, Chernobyl continued to be quietly folded into daily life. Nurses in specialized radiation clinics still treated the occasional late thyroid cancer in former residents of affected regions. Environmental scientists in Germany, Switzerland, Norway, and Britain continued to monitor mushrooms and wild boar for cesium-137. Ukrainian pensioners who had been evacuees in 1986 continued, each April 26th, to gather in small halls and churches to remember. Belarusian schoolchildren were taught, in their biology lessons, about the ways radiation affects cells. Researchers at American universities, funded by grants from decades of continuous interest, updated their databases of thyroid cancer incidents. Archivists in Kyiv catalogued photographs and audio recordings in climate-controlled vaults. Every one of these small activities added, in its way, to the ongoing life of the disaster. There were also, year by year, small intimate rituals that kept the memory alive inside particular families. In Kharkov, a man whose father had been a liquidator laid flowers each spring on his father's grave and told his young children about how their grandfather had gone north to help fight a fire in a strange building. In Kyiv, a woman who had been an 8-year-old in Pripyat on the day of the evacuation kept, in her cupboard, the small cardigan she had been wearing when she boarded the bus. Her mother had saved it, washed it many times, and given it to her daughter in her teenage years. In Belarus, an elderly man whose village had been bulldozed in 1986 made an annual pilgrimage to the remaining cemetery, the only piece of his old home still standing, and weeded the graves of his ancestors. These small private rites, repeated across tens of thousands of families, formed a vast, invisible architecture of memory beneath the more visible monuments and museums. And still, even in the quiet later years, the accident kept teaching. Scientists found in the zone new and interesting things about how organisms adapt to chronic low-dose radiation. Certain fungi appeared to thrive on it, using dark melanin pigments in ways that suggested they might be metabolically benefiting from the radiation environment. Bank voles in the exclusion zone were found to carry elevated levels of particular antioxidant enzymes, as though their populations had been selected over a few dozen generations to better handle oxidative stress. Trees in some of the most contaminated patches grew slightly more slowly than their counterparts outside the zone. But they grew. Ecosystems that should, in theory, have been extinguished, continued. The rigor of the scientific measurements and the stubbornness of the biological facts did not cancel each other out. They complicated each other, and they asked careful observers to hold more than one truth in their minds at once. That, perhaps, is one of the quieter ways Chernobyl changed the world. It required people to think with more than one kind of mind. It did not allow them the easy comfort of a single narrative. It demanded that they recognize, at the same time, that radiation damages life, and that life, when given the chance, finds astonishing ways to carry on. That certain reactors are designed with serious flaws, and that certain operators can push those reactors into danger through accumulated small choices. That state secrecy is a poison, and that communities sometimes need calm, patient, measured communication rather than dramatic disclosure. That the future of nuclear power is unresolved and depends on both technical and political decisions. That grief and beauty in a place like Pripyat can live together without cancelling each other out. Many of these lessons have been learned slowly, over decades, by people who were not especially looking for them, by visitors who found themselves surprised by the zone, by readers who picked up Alexievich's book to satisfy a particular curiosity and put it down changed. There is one more kind of story to include before we turn toward our reflections, and it is the kind we might call the small, vivid detail, the piece of the larger picture whose small size does not prevent it from carrying a great weight of meaning. Histories of major events often move quickly from one scale to another, from the global to the national to the local, and sometimes skip over the individual altogether. But Chernobyl was made of individual details, and some of them are worth pausing over in turn. There was, for example, the story of the pigeon loft. On the morning of April the 26th, an elderly man in Pripyat, who had kept racing pigeons on his apartment balcony for many years, came out to feed his birds as usual, and noticed that several of them were sitting on the rail with their eyes closed, breathing with difficulty. He thought at first that they had eaten something spoiled. He cleaned their perches, changed their water, and sat with them for a while. Only days later, in a refugee center, did he come to understand what his birds had been trying to tell him. The pigeon loft, which he had been forced to leave behind, had stood on the windward side of his building, facing the plant. His birds, spending much of their day on that balcony, had inhaled more dust than their owner. In the slow process of evacuation, he found that, for him, the hardest small loss was the idea of those birds left in their cages without him. And he spoke often to a neighbor who had lived in the next apartment about whether someone in the empty city was looking after them. In time, He learned gently that the soldiers who had been sent to deal with the pets in the zone had found his loft, opened the cages, and let the birds fly. He did not know where they had flown. He chose to believe that some of them, at least, had made it somewhere kinder. There was the story of the young teacher in a village a few kilometers outside the exclusion zone. On the day of the evacuation, she had been supervising a reading lesson in a small classroom with 17 children. When the news arrived that classes were to be suspended and that buses were being sent for the children, she realized quickly that several of the smaller ones were going to be frightened by an unexplained trip without their parents. She spoke with them in her calm, patient voice. She helped them pack their school bags. She walked them to the waiting buses. She climbed up herself, although her own instructions had been to remain behind, and she sat beside them for the entire ride, holding the hand of the smallest one, a girl of 6, who had been separated from her mother for the day. When they arrived at the receiving area, she helped the children find their parents, one by one. She did not go home for 3 days, because there was no safe way to return. She later said, with great modesty, that she had only done what any teacher would have done, and that she remembered the ride as a series of small jokes she had made up to keep the children laughing. The families of those 17 children did not forget. Several decades later, when the teacher turned 80, a delegation of her former students, now adults with children of their own, arrived at her door with flowers and photographs to thank her, very late in the afternoon of her life, for a short bus ride long ago. There was the story of the librarian in Pripyat, whose last act before leaving the city was to lock the doors of her library carefully, to straighten the books on the shelves, to place a small note of apology for any lateness in the returns box, and to leave the key with the building attendant. She did this, she later explained, because even in circumstances like those, she could not bear to leave a library untended. Her books remained inside for years, slowly yellowing on the shelves, until stalkers and other visitors began, in the 1990s, to disturb the rooms. A few of her books were rescued by a photographer, who, recognizing them as perhaps unique specimens of their editions, took them out of the zone for proper cleaning and storage in a small museum. The librarian, still alive when the books were returned, wept when she saw them again. There was the story of the plant's head of the dosimetric service, a careful, fastidious man named Alexander, who, in the first hours of the accident, walked the corridors measuring every room he could reach, writing down each reading in a small notebook, and reporting his findings to a supervisor, whose responses grew increasingly evasive as the afternoon advanced. Alexander was, by training and temperament, a man who believed in numbers. He knew, within hours, that the readings he was taking described an event beyond any category he had been taught, and he knew also that he would be asked to adjust them or to disregard them. He did not do so. He kept his notebook, which survived later investigations, and which served, in the years of inquiry that followed, as one of the clearest records of what the actual radiation levels in the plant had been in the first critical hours. He was later recognized quietly as one of the technical heroes of those early days. He lived a long life, spent most of his later career in radiation protection training, and wrote several textbooks. There was the story of the plant's official photographer, Anatoly Raskazov, who was dispatched up into a helicopter on the morning of April the 26th to take pictures of the damaged reactor from above. He did not know what he would find, He had his large camera, a few lenses, and a number of rolls of film. When the helicopter drew near the reactor, what he saw stunned him. The lid of the reactor had been thrown sideways. A deep orange glow came from the pit. His hands shook as he snapped the shutter. His film, developed later that day in a Moscow photographic laboratory, turned out to be partly ruined, speckled with radiation damage, and some of the frames were essentially lost. But a few survived, and those few images were among the first to show the world what had actually happened inside the reactor vault. Raskazov returned home to his wife. He never flew over the reactor again. His health, over the years, declined. He kept prints of his surviving images on his wall, and he showed them to visitors who asked what he had seen. But in the later decades of his life, he spoke about those pictures less and less often, as if the act of explaining had grown too heavy for him. There was the story of the bell ringer of a small Orthodox church in a village just outside the exclusion zone. This village was not evacuated because it was deemed safely outside the worst plumes. But in the days after the accident, many of its residents panicked and left anyway. The priest stayed. The bell ringer stayed. The bell, a large bronze bell cast in the 19th century, continued to ring for vespers and for funerals every day through the spring and summer of 1986. And the bell ringer, a small, wiry older man with blue eyes and a white beard, climbed his wooden steps each morning to pull the rope. He said, when asked by a journalist years later, that he had never considered stopping. He said that in his village, from the time before memory, the bell had always been rung, and that whatever else was wrong, the bell was not wrong. He rang it until his arms were too tired in old age, when his son took over, and his son rang it until his own retirement, when a grandson took over. And in time, through the quiet succession of ordinary village life, the bell continued to sound its slow bronze notes across a landscape that had seen one of the most dramatic events of the 20th century. There was the story of the postman of Slavutich, the new city built for the relocated workers. For years, long after the plant had closed, he continued to deliver letters to the addresses of liquidators who had since moved away or passed on. Wherever possible, he forwarded their mail to their new homes. In a few cases, envelopes kept arriving from distant relatives who had not heard of deaths, and the postman would patiently write, in neat blue handwriting, a small note explaining the situation before mailing the letter back along its original path. He did this as part of his regular work, without particular drama, because, as he told a local reporter, each letter had somebody on the other end of it, and somebody ought to make sure the letter got where it needed to go, even if that was not where it had originally been addressed. There was the story of the biology student from Kiev University, who, in 1989, began a study of amphibians in the exclusion zone as part of her graduate thesis. She returned to the zone every summer for decades, long after her thesis had been submitted and defended, long after she had become a professor and then an emeritus professor, long after her hair had turned grey. She kept detailed records of the populations of various frogs and newts in specific ponds. She noted trends that were slow, sometimes almost imperceptible. She published papers. She trained students of her own, some of whom took up her work. Her data, in the end, formed one of the longest continuous ecological data sets anyone has ever assembled for a single region of that size. And her graphs of frog abundance over time became, in their quiet way, a kind of natural memorial to the accident. Radiation levels fell, populations fluctuated with weather and disease. Small ponds came and went as beavers built and abandoned their dams. Through all of it, her careful graphs continued, a small, steady line of science drawn patiently across the years. There was the story of the children who grew up in the ordinary towns of Ukraine and Belarus, children who had been toddlers in 1986, or who had been born just after, and who carried with them into their adult lives a peculiar relationship with the word Chernobyl. For them, the disaster was not a single event, but a kind of background weather. They had their thyroid checkups. They had their vaccinations. They had teachers who mentioned radiation with a particular seriousness. They had parents who occasionally grew quiet when the wind blew from the north. When they moved abroad, as many of them did, they sometimes met foreigners who, upon hearing the name of their hometown, would widen their eyes and ask, carefully, whether the person had been affected. The answer, usually, was a modest, complicated yes. That yes, in a way, they had been affected, but so had everyone they knew, and in many ways, they were fine. They were, in that word, the Chernobyl generation, and their particular calm carried silently the long, slow lesson of growing up in the shadow of a place one does not like to think about too often, but also does not forget. And there was, finally, the story of the plant itself. In the quiet later decades, as a working site of slow decommissioning, the cooling pond over time began to recede. Much of its water was gradually drained as it was no longer needed, and the exposed bed around its edges attracted migrating birds in great numbers. The old turbine halls were emptied of their usable parts and then cleaned and locked. The spent fuel pools of the surviving reactors, which had held spent assemblies since the plant's operational years, were gradually unloaded into a new dry storage facility built on the site. A long, low concrete building in which canisters of spent fuel were placed in carefully shielded slots. Workers at the plant continued to walk the corridors in white uniforms, check their dosimeters, eat their lunches in the cafeteria, talk about their children, retire on schedule. New hires arrived each year, young engineers who had been born long after the accident, for whom the name Chernobyl was both a workplace and a piece of national history. They studied the plant's archives, learned its procedures, and, when asked, told visiting journalists that what they were doing was, in their own small way, the finishing of the work their parents and grandparents had started. When one stands back from all of this, from the night of April 26th, from the roofs and helicopters, from the firefighters and dosimetrists, from the helicopters and the sarcophagus, from the decades of science and story, certain patterns emerge that are worth lingering on quietly, because they speak not only about a single reactor, but about the kind of creature human beings are when they build and manage, and sometimes fail to manage, the large, complex machines of our time. The first pattern is the one historians of science sometimes call the normalization of deviance. It is the habit, common in every industry where complex machines are run under pressure, of slowly growing accustomed to small departures from the official rules until those departures are no longer seen as departures at all. At Chernobyl, this habit had many forms. Operators ran the reactor in configurations that were, in theory, forbidden, because in practice, they had done so before without visible harm. Supervisors approved test procedures that had known gaps because pressing ahead was easier than sending the paperwork back to Moscow. Management tolerated a safety culture that emphasized production targets and political milestones more than quiet, patient drills. Each of these small deviations was, on its own, almost invisible. Together, they formed a kind of institutional invisibility inside which a particular dangerous combination could eventually arise without being noticed. What makes Chernobyl a valuable case for later students of risk is not that it was unique in this respect, but that it was not unique. Similar patterns can be seen in the space shuttle accidents, in certain aviation disasters, in financial crises, in public health failures. The accident reminds us that safety is not a state that can be achieved once. It is a practice that must be renewed every day, with humility. The second pattern is the cost of secrecy. In the first 48 hours of the accident, and indeed in the decades before it, the Soviet habit of limiting information did a great deal of harm. It delayed the evacuation of Pripyat. It delayed warnings to citizens of Belarus and Ukraine. It delayed the provision of stable iodine, which could have reduced the uptake of radioactive iodine by children's thyroids. It also, in the longer term, corroded the trust of citizens in their own institutions. People who had been told, in the first days, that nothing was seriously wrong, learned, over the weeks that followed, that a great deal had been wrong. And from that moment forward, they found themselves unable to take official statements at face value. That kind of damaged trust, once it spreads, is as hard to rebuild as any physical piece of infrastructure. What the accident demonstrated, with particular clarity, was that even when the short-term political cost of honesty appears great, the long-term cost of the alternative is almost always greater. Every later disaster has offered the same lesson in a new form, and every later government has had to decide, often in a matter of hours, whether to tell its people the truth in time for it to matter. The third pattern is the one that might be called the loneliness of complex systems. When something goes wrong inside a modern technology as intricate as a nuclear reactor, very few people in the world are in a position to understand fully what has happened. Even inside a plant, only a narrow band of senior engineers and physicists can follow every detail. For everyone else, the reactor is a black box whose inner workings can only be inferred from dials and displays. This arrangement works beautifully when all is well. When something breaks, it creates a peculiar kind of isolation, in which those who do understand must try to explain, very quickly, to those who do not, what the real danger is. At Chernobyl, the engineers who first grasped what had happened struggled over hours and days to convey that understanding up the chain of command. Their arguments were sometimes met with disbelief, not necessarily from malice, but from the simple fact that the truth they were reporting was, to the politicians and generals hearing it, so outside of the shape of any previous experience, that it seemed unreal. This is a story that will, almost certainly, repeat itself in our century in many different domains. Complex systems, whether chemical plants, artificial intelligences, financial networks, or climate models, all share the same structural loneliness. Their risks can only be communicated through careful translation, and that translation requires time, patience, humility, and prepared ears on the other side. The fourth pattern is the unexpected resilience of life. We have seen in the exclusion zone how wolves and storks and horses return to empty landscapes, how forests regrow, how fungi learn to live in radioactive soils. This resilience does not mean that the accident was not harmful. It means that life, taken as a whole, has a capacity for gentle persistence that should comfort us. It also means that human beings are not the only measure of a landscape. When our ambitions falter, the land continues, with its own slow processes, to repair and rearrange itself. In a way, the exclusion zone has become one of the most vivid demonstrations in modern Europe of what the world looks like when we step back from it. This is not an argument for stepping back. It is a quiet reminder that if we were ever to do so, on a larger scale, the planet would not simply end. It would continue, with us or without us, in its own patient rhythms. That knowledge sits, for careful observers of the zone, as a kind of melancholy consolation, alongside the tragedy of the accident. The fifth pattern, perhaps the most important of all, is the dignity of ordinary work. So much of what was heroic about Chernobyl, after the first extraordinary hours, consisted not of single bold decisions, but of the patient, uncelebrated labor of thousands of people doing their ordinary jobs unusually well. The firefighters climbed their ladders as they had been trained. The nurses changed dressings as they had been trained. The engineers drew up specifications for the sarcophagus as they had been trained. The coal miners dug their tunnel as they had been trained. The photographers photographed. The dosimetrists measured. The teachers taught. The librarians locked their doors. The postmen delivered their letters. Each of them, in turn, brought to a moment of enormous stress the habits of their craft, and those habits, trained, rehearsed, internalized over years, carried them through. We sometimes imagine that great crises require the sudden emergence of extraordinary virtue, as though courage were a new material that the world manufactures in emergencies. Chernobyl suggests a quieter truth, that courage in a crisis is usually the product of competence, decency, and community, practiced daily in small ways, long before the crisis arrives. If we want our societies to handle future emergencies well, we might do worse than to pay more attention to the quiet conditions that allow such competence, decency, and community to flourish in ordinary times. The sixth and final pattern, perhaps, is the strange way in which a disaster can, over generations, become part of a shared inheritance. We do not always choose which events enter the long memory of our cultures, but certain ones, through their particular shape, seem to settle into that memory permanently. Chernobyl is one of them. It is likely that, 100 years from now, the name of that small Ukrainian plant will still be known, just as the names of Hiroshima and Nagasaki are still known almost a century after they were darkened. Its lessons will still be being drawn. Its images, the Ferris wheel, the empty classroom, the silver dome over the reactor, will still be circulating in some form, new enough to hold attention, but old enough to carry the weight of ancestry. The people we have followed tonight, the ordinary men and women of Pripyat, and the plant and the countryside, will in this way continue to teach, long after their own lives have ended, about the power of the atom, the cost of secrecy, the fragility of careful machines, and the stubborn beauty of the living world. Those are perhaps the 6 quiet reflections that most naturally rise from a slow, patient contemplation of this particular disaster. None of them is a conclusion. Each of them is an invitation, really, to keep thinking about the rest of our complex world in the same careful spirit. If the story of Chernobyl has a moral, It is a gentle one. Pay attention to the systems we build. Tell the truth about them. Make sure that the people who run them are decent, rested, and respected. Remember that every machine is surrounded by a web of human lives, and that those lives matter more than the machines do. Keep a clear eye on the small things, the everyday habits and the quiet procedures, because those are where the shape of the future is most often decided. And so, after all of this long walk through the corridors of the plant, through the empty streets of Pripyat, through the helicopters and the hospital wards, through the forests where wolves now travel the paths that farmers once walked, through the libraries and the bell towers, and the small, stubborn villages of the Samosli, we arrive at the quiet inner center of the question we set out with. How did this single April night in 1986, in one small corner of Soviet Ukraine, change the world forever? And what does that change mean almost 4 decades later for those of us who were not there, who were perhaps not yet alive, but who have inherited the consequences of what happened? The simplest answer is that the world was changed by Chernobyl in the way that a long, calm lake is changed when a stone of unusual size is thrown into it. The splash was visible and loud and terrifying in the first hours and days. The waves that followed spread outward in ring after ring, each wave slightly smaller than the last, but each touching a greater circumference of lives and places. The waves that reached the shore of the nuclear industry changed how reactors are designed, how they are regulated, how they are watched. The waves that reached the shore of public health changed how radiation exposure is measured, communicated, and treated. The waves that reach the shore of politics changed how governments account for their own mistakes, how openness is weighed against reassurance, how international cooperation is built around dangerous technologies. The waves that reach the shore of culture change the stories our societies tell about progress, about science, about the limits of human confidence. The waves that reach the shore of private life changed families in Kiev and Minsk, in Gomel and Kharkov, in Moscow and Novosibirsk. And then, more gradually, in Paris, Rome, Stockholm, and in the smaller homes of countless sheep farmers in Scotland and Wales. Even the smallest waves, by the time they arrived, had helped to rearrange the furniture of everyday assumptions around the world. The more careful answer is that Chernobyl did not single-handedly cause any of the changes that followed, but it accelerated many of them and gave them a particular shape. The Soviet Union was already struggling. Chernobyl helped to tip it toward its eventual transformation. The nuclear industry was already being debated. Chernobyl gave the debate urgency and new facts. Glasnost was already being attempted. Chernobyl made it harder to retreat from. Public interest in environmental questions was already rising in many Western countries. Chernobyl provided an unforgettable illustration of what could go wrong when pollution is invisible and the polluters are secretive. In each case, the accident did not write the story from scratch, but it wrote a paragraph that could not be unwritten, and that paragraph set the tone for what came next. If we ask more personally, what lessons Chernobyl still holds for humanity today, we might gather them into a small handful of careful sentences. The first is that complex technologies demand honesty. Our machines have grown, since 1986, more intricate rather than less. Our power plants, our airplanes, our networks, our artificial intelligences, our genetic laboratories, our financial systems, our climate models, all of them carry within them configurations whose failure could matter on scales far beyond any single building. Each of them requires, in order to be safe, a culture of people who will say, gently but clearly, what they are seeing, even when what they are seeing is inconvenient. Any culture that punishes such honesty, or merely fails to reward it, sets itself up to repeat some version of Pripyat. The second lesson is that respect for ordinary people is not a luxury, but a load-bearing element of any safety system. The children of Pripyat, who went to school on the morning of April 26th, had the right to know what had happened in the night. The families who lived downwind had the right to be told to stay indoors. The liquidators who climbed onto the roof had the right to know their doses. The evacuees had the right to be given time to pack what mattered to them. In each case, those rights were honored imperfectly, and in each case, the imperfections translated directly into human cost. A society that trusts its citizens with difficult truth is not a society that is inviting panic. It is a society that is building, day by day, the fabric from which calm, thoughtful responses can later be sown. A society that believes its citizens cannot handle the truth will sooner or later have to explain to those citizens why it did not tell them, and that conversation is far harder to hold than the original honest one would have been. The third lesson is that nuclear power, as a technology, is neither the villain nor the hero that some of its critics and advocates have made it out to be. It is a tool, like many tools, with particular strengths and particular risks. The strengths are real: high energy density, low greenhouse gas emissions, a demonstrated ability to provide steady electricity to large modern grids. The risks are also real: the long-term problem of spent fuel, the possibility of severe accidents under unusual conditions, the challenge of protecting plants against war and sabotage. Chernobyl does not settle the question of whether or how to use nuclear power. What it does is raise the standard of seriousness with which that question must be discussed. Anyone who argues that nuclear reactors are simply safe or simply dangerous is missing the nuance that this accident taught us to insist on. A good nuclear reactor, well regulated, staffed by trained people who are allowed to raise concerns, can be one of the most helpful machines in the energy landscape. A badly designed reactor, staffed by tired operators, working under political pressure in a culture of silence, can be among the most harmful. The same is true, in varying forms, of almost every serious technology we have built since. The fourth lesson is about the long shape of time. Chernobyl did not end on April 26, 1986, and it will not end in our lifetimes. The half-life of cesium-137 is roughly 30 years, which means that the cesium released in 1986 is still, in 2026, at about half of its original activity, and will not fall to negligible levels for another century or more. The new safe confinement is rated for a century of service, and the final dismantling of what lies beneath it will take decades after that. The zone, in some form, will continue to exist for generations. The health and environmental effects will continue to be studied. The children of evacuees will inherit their family stories. Projects begun today will not be completed until by people not yet born. This long shape of time is in its way one of the most humbling things the disaster has taught. It reminds us that actions taken in a few seconds inside the reactor hall of Unit 4 can write themselves onto the future in ways that outlast every life we know. And it reminds us that we, who live in our own few seconds of history, are likewise writing onto the same long parchment, sometimes without noticing. The fifth lesson is gentler. It is that even inside tragedy, there can be great beauty, and the beauty does not cancel the tragedy, but sits beside it, patiently, quietly, teaching its own lessons. The quiet dignity of Lyudmila at her husband's bedside, the unhurried care of the teacher with her 17 small charges, the bronze bell ringing each morning in its village, the wolves running across the snow of the red forest in winter, the return of the black storks to their nests on the abandoned chimneys, the bright yellow paint of the Ferris wheel, still visible through the trees, the librarian who could not leave without locking her doors, the postman who could not leave a letter undelivered, the physicist who kept careful readings even when he was asked not to. All of these small, human, irreducibly particular things live together in the memory of the accident, and together they form something that is not simply sorrow and not simply inspiration, but a kind of larger, quieter understanding of what it means to be a human being in a time of great machines and great mistakes. We set out together at the beginning of this story to step into one of the strangest and most unforgettable corners of the 20th century. We have walked through it now, slowly, attentively, and perhaps we have come, along the way, to know it a little. We have sat in the control room as the needle crept upward on the power meter. We have climbed the ladders with the firefighters. We have boarded the buses with the children of Pripyat. We have watched the helicopters over the burning graphite. We have sat with Lyudmila in the hospital. We have walked with the biology student through her long summers of careful observation. We have listened to the bell. We have felt the weight of the sarcophagus and the slow, patient grandeur of the new, safe confinement. We have stood on the railway bridge, not in curiosity, but in memory, and we have let the small, invisible wind of the plume pass through us into the wider story. What lingers after all this is not only the sadness of what happened, but the extraordinary fact that it did indeed change the world. Not only in the obvious ways, the policies, the industries, the regulations, but in the less visible ways that nonetheless shape how we think about the choices we are now making. The accident taught us that the places where disasters are prepared are not only physical places, they are cultural places as well, made of habits of mind as much as of concrete and steel. The disaster reminded us that the cost of secrecy accumulates in silence for many years before it is finally measured. The disaster reminded us that the dignity of ordinary work is one of the most important moral resources any society possesses. The disaster reminded us that the natural world is both more fragile and more resilient than our simplest stories allow. And the disaster reminded us, perhaps most of all, that the human beings around any complicated machine are not, and never will be, mere accessories to the machine. They are the center of what the machine is and what it means. If there is a single image that carries all of this in a small and portable form, it may be the image of that Ferris wheel in Pripyat, standing in the center of its quiet park, its yellow gondolas still and silent, its circular shape drawn against a sky that continues to turn its seasons slowly overhead. The Ferris wheel was never used by the children for whom it was built. It was prepared for a celebration that never took place. It is now, decades later, visited by strangers who did not know those children, who come to look at it thoughtfully and then to move on. It has become, without anyone planning it so, a small monument to the idea that certain futures are closed by the events of a single night. But it also stands stubbornly against that same sky and seems to say, in its slow, rusted way, that even foreclosed futures remain part of the world, that the small hopes behind them, the children who would have ridden, the engineers who had built it, the town that had gathered around it, were real, that the world is filled with similar small hopes in every city and every countryside, and that our shared task in the long aftermath of any disaster is to take those hopes seriously enough to protect them in time. That, in the end, is what the Chernobyl disaster asked of the world and continues to ask in its patient way every year on its anniversary. It asked the world to take seriously the small, ordinary living hopes that its machines are supposed to serve. It asked for honesty from those who run great systems and for kindness from those who live near them. It asked for care. It asked for attention. It asked to be remembered, not as a cloud of abstract data, but as a gathering of faces, of names, of families, of yellow gondolas and small blue wooden houses, and the quiet hum of a reactor on a spring night. We have tried, in our long, patient companionship tonight, to listen to some of those faces and names, and to hold them in our minds with the gentleness they deserve. We have tried to let the long shape of the story settle into place, slowly, detail by detail, so that it can live in us, not as a sensational legend, but as a grown-up, careful memory. The world was indeed changed by what happened there. It was changed by the explosion. It was changed by the cover-up. It was changed by the evacuations and the long, slow decades of decontamination. It was changed by the scientists and the writers and the photographers and the ecologists. It was changed by the wolves returning, and by the horses running, and by the bells ringing, and by the children who grew up in its shadow. It was changed by the cultural memory that continues to ripple outward, year after year, in films and books and quiet private conversations in every corner of the globe. And though the changes are not all simple and are not all easy, they have added, in their total weight, to the ways our species understands itself, its powers, its mistakes, and the ordinary resilience that allows it, after every stumble, to keep going,